Story 1. There was something about mirrors that unsettled Nathan. It wasn't the simple reflection of light and shape, of course, everyone understood that. No, it was the way they always felt, too still, too silent, too knowing, as if the glass held secrets, something waiting beneath its surface, something that watched him. The longer he stood in front of the antique mirror in his apartment, the more this unsettling sensation gnawed at him. The mirror itself wasn't particularly special, just a simple, ornate frame that seemed to belong to another era. He had picked it up at a thrift shop a few months ago, not because it was beautiful, but because it had an old-world charm. It fit perfectly in his living room, casting an eerie glow at night when the lights were dim. But now, it felt different. As Nathan stared at his reflection, he began to notice something off. The man staring back at him wasn't smiling, yet there was something in his eyes, something unsettling, something that made his pulse quicken. His heartbeat began to thud in his ears, louder, faster. The man's eyes seemed to know something. It was as if they held a secret, a silent understanding. Nathan blinked, but the reflection remained the same. It wasn't right. His breath grew shallow as he stared at the mirror, trying to dismiss the growing dread. It's just the lighting, he thought. Just a trick of the shadows. But no, the reflection didn't change. The man in the mirror was staring at him, watching him, his eyes locked with Nathan's, filled with an unsettling intensity. Every muscle in Nathan's body froze. He turned his head slightly, and the man in the mirror followed, exactly. He took a step back, the cold air of the room now prickling his skin. But the man in the mirror didn't move, not physically. But something shifted, something subtle. Nathan's breath hitched as the mirror's surface rippled, just for a second. It felt alive. The glass seemed to breathe. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling. "You're seeing things," he muttered to himself, forcing a chuckle. But deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. And that terrified him. That night, the unease didn't fade. It grew, wrapping around him like a thick fog. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still feel the weight of those eyes in the mirror. The man, watching him. The whispers, soft, like a distant wind, began to creep into his thoughts. "Why do you hide?" The voice whispered, so soft, yet unmistakable. It was too close, as though it was coming from inside the room. "You cannot run from yourself." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. Was this a dream? Was he losing his mind? He couldn't tell. His pulse quickened, his body tensing as he held his breath and listened. The voice didn't stop. "Who are you?" Nathan asked, his voice trembling, unable to mask the panic rising in his chest. The whispering chuckled softly, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't his voice. It was wrong. "I am you, Nathan. The version of you that never learned to hide." The words sliced through him, sending a jolt of fear that made his chest tighten. His throat closed. He couldn't move. The voice didn't just speak, it seemed to invade his thoughts, tugging at the edges of his mind, twisting every word into something darker. Something insidious. "Let me show you," the voice purred, like a shadow in his soul, making his blood run cold. The next morning, Nathan awoke with a jolt. His heart raced, pounding in his chest as though it wanted to escape his body. Sweat drenched his skin, his breath shallow, his mind spinning. He turned on the lamp beside his bed, eyes darting around the room as though expecting something to jump out at him. But everything was still. Quiet. It had only been a nightmare. A bad dream. He tried to convince himself. Just a nightmare. But the unease lingered, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't shake it. Something was wrong. As he walked to the bathroom, the mirror caught his eye again. This time, as he brushed his teeth, he froze. His reflection wasn't moving like he was. It lingered, a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The gap was imperceptible, but it felt like a warning. He stared into his own eyes, searching for something familiar. But all he saw was a cold, distant gaze, like staring into the eyes of a stranger. His heart skipped a beat. Just a trick of the light, he whispered to himself, but even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. It wasn't the light. It was something else. As the day wore on, the whispers returned. Faint at first, but impossible to ignore. The man in the mirror was no longer just a reflection, he was something else. Something detached. Unfamiliar. His reflection seemed to move without his command. His eyes glinted with an awareness that sent shivers down Nathan's spine. Something was wrong. That night, as he stood before the mirror once more, the whisper returned, louder. More forceful. "I know what you fear, Nathan," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "I know your secrets." The days blurred into each other, a haze of creeping terror. The whispers never stopped. The reflection was never quite his own. The man in the mirror always seemed one step ahead, mocking him, watching him, waiting. By the end of the week, Nathan was no longer sure where the reflection ended and where he began. The face in the mirror was no longer his. The eyes, dark and hollow, were filled with secrets he didn't want to know. Something was hidden in those eyes. Something ancient. Something dangerous. Nathan's mind was unraveling. That night, desperate, he stood before the mirror one final time. The reflection was waiting, just as it always had been. But tonight, something was different. "I'm tired of waiting, Nathan," the voice growled, low and menacing. "Come closer." Nathan's heart thudded in his chest, louder than ever. He stared into the mirror, his reflection waiting. Slowly, trembling, he reached out. The cold glass seemed to pull him in. And as his fingers brushed against the surface, the reflection reached back. The world spun, and everything went black. Nathan woke up to the sound of his own breathing, harsh and shallow. He jolted upright, eyes scanning his surroundings, heart racing. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry. He was no longer standing in front of the mirror. No, he was in his bed, back in the same apartment, but everything felt wrong. The room was dimly lit, bathed in a strange, muted light that didn't seem to come from anywhere. The walls seemed to close in on him, their once familiar angles distorted, as though they had stretched and bent in unnatural ways. His body felt heavy, almost as if the air itself was pressing down on him. The whispers were gone, but an eerie silence filled the room, suffocating and unnatural. Nathan rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fog that clouded his mind. It was a dream, he told himself. A nightmare. But something deep inside him told him it was more than that. The moment he turned his head to the side, he felt it, an unsettling presence, like someone was watching him. His breath caught in his throat. And then, he heard it, the softest of sounds, a whisper that chilled him to his very core. "Welcome back, Nathan." He froze, his spine going rigid as the voice crawled across his skin, familiar yet unrecognizable. His reflection. The man from the mirror. It was him, but there was something more in the tone. Something darker. Nathan scrambled out of bed, his pulse pounding in his ears. He rushed to the bathroom, desperate to get away from whatever was haunting him. As he stumbled through the apartment, everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulsate with some kind of life, their colors shifting in subtle, disturbing ways. It was as if the house itself had become a part of the nightmare. He flung open the bathroom door and rushed toward the mirror. The reflection was waiting for him. For a moment, Nathan stood frozen in front of the mirror, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The man staring back at him wasn't just a reflection, it was an entity. His face was contorted, twisted into an expression that was both alien and familiar. The eyes were the most disturbing part, dark and hollow, but with a glimmer of something else, something Nathan couldn't place. For a brief second, he thought he saw the reflection smile. A slow, creeping smile that sent shivers crawling down his spine. The man in the mirror wasn't mimicking his every movement now. No, it was as if it were living, breathing, on its own. The reflection blinked, a deliberate, knowing movement, and Nathan flinched as though the eyes were staring directly into his soul. "No," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "This isn't real." The reflection in the mirror didn't answer, but the smile widened. Nathan felt something shift inside him. There was no longer any semblance of who he once was. His reflection, no, the other version of him, was not just a silent observer. It was beginning to control him, starting with his thoughts. "You think you can escape me?" The voice came from the mirror, but it wasn't the soft whisper of before. Now, it was deep, guttural, and more commanding. It didn't need to speak in whispers anymore. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the glass. His reflection remained, its eyes never leaving him. "I am you, Nathan. And you are me," it said, the words settling into his bones like an invasive disease. "No," Nathan muttered, shaking his head. "I am me." But even as he said it, he realized how hollow the words felt. His reflection didn't flinch, didn't respond in the way a normal reflection should. Instead, the man in the glass stepped forward, closer, and Nathan's body followed. He didn't have control of his own movements. His knees buckled, and he collapsed in front of the mirror, his fingers trembling as they reached for it. He wanted to touch the surface, to confirm that it was just a trick of the mind, but he was afraid of what might happen next. What if he touched the mirror and the reflection reached back? A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His breathing became erratic. The reflection continued to watch, silent and waiting. Nathan stumbled away from the mirror, the sense of reality slipping through his fingers. The whispers returned, louder this time, pressing on him from all sides. They were not coming from the mirror anymore, they were coming from inside his head. "You're not meant to be here," the voice growled. "You should have left when you had the chance." Nathan staggered to the window, pulling the blinds open in a desperate bid to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the apartment. The outside world seemed far away, unreachable. The city was still, lifeless, like a painting on a canvas that had been painted over time and again. Nothing felt real anymore. He could feel the reflection's presence crawling under his skin, consuming him. His hands trembled as he ran them through his hair. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered, trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. But deep down, he knew something far more sinister was at work. The reflection didn't just want him to see it, it wanted to control him. The whispers were no longer vague threats, they were clear instructions, pushing him to do things he couldn't explain. "Go back to the mirror, Nathan," the voice coaxed, slick and smooth like oil and water. "Come to me, and I'll show you what you're really capable of." Nathan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to obey. His mind screamed to resist, but his body moved on its own. He turned around. He walked toward the bathroom again. Each step felt as though he were sinking deeper into a nightmare, one that had no end. The door to the bathroom swung open with a creak, and there it was again, the mirror, beckoning him. "I am you," the voice repeated. "You cannot hide from yourself." Nathan stood frozen in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. This time, however, he didn't recognize the man in the glass. He didn't even feel like the person standing in front of it was him. It wasn't just a distortion, it was a completely different version of him. The reflection's eyes were colder, its smile wider, more malicious. There was no trace of the Nathan he had once been. The whispers filled his mind again, louder now, almost deafening. He couldn't make them stop. "I told you, you cannot escape," it whispered. The reflection's lips twisted into a grin, its eyes gleaming with wicked delight. It wasn't just mocking him anymore. It was taunting him, as if it knew something Nathan didn't. "You think you control me?" The voice was everywhere now, in his mind, in his ears. "You've always been mine. I've always been here." Nathan staggered backward, the cold grip of panic seizing his chest. His own reflection was turning on him, showing him things he never wanted to see. He could hear it, his reflection laughing. It was him. It was Nathan. But it wasn't. Nathan's heart raced. His mind screamed for him to stop, to leave, to get out of the apartment and never look back. But he was trapped. There was no escape from the mirror. And the voice, the thing that was once a reflection of himself, had become something far darker. Nathan's hands shook as he clutched the edge of the sink, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had lost all sense of time. The room around him seemed to sway, bending under the weight of his own thoughts. The mirror before him was no longer just a reflection, it was a window to something else, something that had been slowly consuming him from the inside out. His pulse raced in his ears, drowning out everything else. The voice, his reflection, the thing staring back at him, it had taken on a life of its own. He tried to look away, to escape the suffocating grip of the mirror, but his eyes kept darting back to it. Each time, the reflection became clearer, more distinct. His own face, his own body, was no longer his. The smile in the mirror wasn't his. The eyes staring back at him weren't his either. They were hollow, empty, and full of darkness, as if the reflection was mocking him, showing him what he truly was. "Why do you keep running, Nathan?" The voice purred from the glass, smooth like velvet, but cold as ice. "I'm not going to let you go. Not until you understand what you've become." Nathan stumbled back, his breath ragged and his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to yell, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Every time he tried to speak, his voice was swallowed by the deafening silence that filled the room. The reflection's grin widened. It wasn't an expression of amusement, it was something much darker. Something predatory. "I am you," the voice continued, its tone growing more forceful, more desperate. "I always have been. You've always known this, deep down." Nathan clutched his head, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in around him, the mirror drawing him in, pulling him toward it. His hands moved of their own accord, reaching for the glass, as though it had a hold on him, like an invisible hand wrapping around his wrist, pulling him in. "No," Nathan gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You're not real. You can't be real." But the reflection didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, closer than ever before, until it was so close that Nathan could see the faint, sinister details, the glint of its eyes, the sharpness of its teeth, its very being made of nothing but malice. "You don't understand," the voice said, its tone now a growl, filled with contempt. "You are nothing without me. You are nothing without the reflection. You've always been empty." With a sudden, terrifying clarity, Nathan understood. The reflection wasn't just a twisted version of him. It was the part of him that he had always hidden, the darkness within. The desires he had suppressed, the lies he told himself, the guilt he could never shake, it was all coming to the surface now. The reflection had brought them all to light, and there was no escape. "I'm not you," Nathan cried, his voice breaking. "I am me." But the voice only laughed, low and menacing. "No, Nathan. You're me now." 3.2 The Descent. The room around Nathan began to blur, the edges of his vision darkening as his mind spiraled. The whispering began again, louder this time, echoing in his skull like 1,000 voices trapped inside. His pulse quickened, his hands trembling as he pressed them against his ears, trying to block it out. But the voice, his reflection's voice, was relentless. "You think you can resist me?" it sneered. "You think you can escape the truth? You are nothing. You always have been." Nathan backed away from the mirror, his body shaking with terror, but he couldn't escape it. The room was too small, the walls closing in like the jaws of some unseen predator. He could feel the reflection in the mirror pulling at him, dragging him toward it with an invisible force. Every movement, every breath, felt wrong. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare that never ended. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could hear was the voice that was slowly consuming him, slowly taking over his mind. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening roar inside his head. "You don't deserve to live," the voice hissed, each word dripping with venom. "You don't deserve to exist. But I do. And I will make you see that." Nathan's vision blurred even further. His hands reached out to steady himself, but his fingers touched something cold, smooth, unyielding. The mirror. It was still there, its surface cold and reflective, and Nathan could see the dark figure of the reflection watching him, waiting. The figure in the mirror grinned. "Come to me, Nathan," it whispered, its voice full of hunger. "You know you want to." A sudden, overwhelming urge washed over him, a pull that he couldn't resist. The darkness inside him surged forward, pushing aside every shred of logic, every part of him that screamed for him to stop. He felt his hand reaching out, his fingers grazing the surface of the mirror. And when his skin touched the cold glass, something snapped. 3.3 The Other Side. Nathan was no longer standing in his apartment. The familiar walls, the cold, lifeless air, everything he knew had faded away, leaving only darkness. He was weightless, floating in a void where there was no up, no down, no direction at all. He could feel his breath catch in his throat, but there was no sound, no noise, no movement. The whispers were gone. In their place was a terrible silence that pressed against him, suffocating him, as though the very air was thick with some unseen force. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Where was he? What was happening? And then he heard it. A voice. His reflection's voice. "You thought you could escape me?" it taunted, its tone dark, triumphant. Nathan looked around, but saw nothing, no walls, no ceiling, no floor. Only the infinite darkness stretching out before him. And then, from that darkness, a figure began to take shape. It was him. But it wasn't. The man standing before him was a distorted version of himself. His face was pale, cracked like porcelain, and his eyes were black, like the void itself. His smile was wide, jagged, filled with sharp, gleaming teeth. "You don't belong here," the reflection said, its voice no longer a whisper but a deafening roar. "This is where I exist." This is where I rule. And you are mine. The reflection reached out, and as its hand touched Nathan's chest, the darkness surged, swallowing him whole. 3.4 The final choice. Nathan woke up gasping, his chest heating as he sat up in his bed. His heart was pounding, sweat soaking his clothes, and the room felt unnaturally cold. It had all been a dream, a nightmare. He was back in his apartment, the familiar surroundings bringing him some measure of comfort. But when he looked at the mirror again, he saw it. The reflection. It was him. And it wasn't. It was standing just behind him, its eyes fixed on his, its smile wide and unrelenting. You belong to me now, the voice whispered from the glass, and Nathan realized, with a sickening certainty, that it was true. He had never been in control. The mirror had claimed him, and there was no turning back. Nathan stood frozen in front of the mirror, his heart hammering in his chest as the reflection smiled back at him, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural satisfaction. The apartment around him, once familiar, now felt suffocating. The air was thick with tension, the silence oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in. The reflection, now fully visible in the glass, was not his own. It was a distorted version of him, pale, twisted, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to see into his very soul. The voice came again, louder this time, resonating in his mind, louder than ever before. You are mine now, Nathan. You have always been mine. No, Nathan whispered, shaking his head, his breath ragged. No, I'm not. But even as the words escaped his lips, Nathan knew they weren't true. His reflection had taken him, body and soul, and now he was trapped in this endless nightmare. There was no escape. He was no longer in control. The mirror had claimed him, and with it, the darkness within. You never truly understood, did you? The reflection's voice was cold and mocking, carrying an air of finality. You thought you could run. You thought you could hide. But I was always here, Nathan. In you. With you. Watching. Nathan's eyes widened in realization, his mind swimming in disbelief. The reflection wasn't just some supernatural force, it was a part of him, something he had always suppressed, something he had never fully acknowledged. It was the darkness in his soul, the fears and insecurities, the guilt and regrets. And now, that darkness had taken form, taking him with it. No! Nathan shouted, his voice breaking as he backed away from the mirror. I don't want this. I don't want to be you. But the reflection didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, its grin growing wider, more sinister. The glass seemed to ripple and distort as the figure reached out, its hand moving like liquid across the surface. You already are me, it said. And you always will be. Nathan stumbled backward, his body trembling with fear. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The air grew thick, as if the very space around him was closing in. The walls seemed to melt, and the mirror began to crack, the edges splintering like glass under pressure. The whispers returned, louder than before. The reflection's voice was all around him now, pressing on him from every direction. You cannot escape. You never could. Nathan's knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, his hands clutching his head as the voices, the whispers, and the laughter filled his mind. He could feel his sanity slipping, his grip on reality slipping further and further away. The reflection's laughter echoed in his ears, drowning out everything else. No. I can't, Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. I don't want this. But it was too late. Suddenly, the reflection stopped laughing. The room fell silent, so silent that Nathan could hear his own ragged breathing, his heart thudding in his chest. The dark figure in the mirror stepped forward, its eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made Nathan's stomach churn. "There's only one way out," the reflection said, its voice soft, almost pitying. "But you have to give yourself fully to me. You have to let go of who you were, of everything you thought you knew." Nathan's mind screamed in protest. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to stop this madness, to break free from the suffocating grip of the mirror. But deep down, a part of him knew that the reflection was right. There was no escape. "I won't," Nathan spat, his voice weak but defiant. "I won't give in." The reflection smiled, its lips curling into a sinister grin. "Then you will remain here. Forever." For a moment, Nathan felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The room seemed to close in tighter, the air growing colder, the darkness pressing against him like a living, breathing entity. The whispers returned, a cacophony of voices, all of them his own, telling him he was nothing, that he had always been nothing. And then, in the depths of that overwhelming darkness, he saw it, the final choice. It was a choice that could never be taken back. A choice between accepting the reflection's grip on his soul or fading into the mirror itself, lost to the void forever. He reached out, his fingers trembling, as he looked at the reflection one final time. The mirror flickered, its surface rippling like water. "No," he whispered again, but this time, the word didn't feel like a plea. It felt like a surrender. He stepped forward, and the reflection stepped out. The moment Nathan crossed the threshold, everything around him changed. The room, the apartment, the mirror, it all shattered, breaking apart like fragile glass. The world around him dissolved into fragments, pieces of his past, his memories, slipping away like sand through his fingers. In the endless void, there was only the reflection, only the version of himself that he had never wanted to face. But now, it was real. And Nathan realized, with a sickening twist in his stomach, that he had become part of it. Part of the reflection. There was no more him, there was only this. "I am you," the voice echoed, now all around him, inside him. "You are me. And we are one." Nathan screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. And then, there was silence. Underscore. The mirror was empty now. Nathan was gone. The apartment was quiet, still. And in the cracked mirror, the reflection stared back. Story 2. Maggie had always been an insomniac. For as long as she could remember, sleep had been elusive, slipping through her fingers like sand. She had tried everything. Sleeping pills, herbal teas, sound machines. Nothing worked. She lay in bed night after night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the endless ticking of the clock, the creak of the house settling. The silence was deafening. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the silence had teeth. She had already been tossing and turning for hours, the clock on the nightstand ticking away the minutes like a cruel reminder of her sleeplessness. Her eyes felt heavy, her eyelids sagging, but every time she closed them, her mind raced with thoughts that wouldn't settle. The shadows in the room seemed to move, twisting into shapes she couldn't quite place. She felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She groaned, sitting up in bed and rubbing her eyes. Another sleepless night. The worst part wasn't the lack of sleep, it was the feeling that she was losing time. Hours blurred into one another, and the days seemed to fade together like watercolor paint smudging on a canvas. She reached over to her bedside table and grabbed her phone. The screen lit up with a dim glow, the harsh brightness cutting through the darkness like a blade. It was 2:47 a.m. She sighed, placing the phone back down, and then, out of habit, she reached for the old radio on her nightstand. It was a vintage model, one her grandmother had given her years ago. Maggie wasn't sure why she still kept it, but it had a comforting presence, an old-world feeling. She turned the dial, searching for a station, any station, just to fill the quiet. At first, there was only the dull hum of static, the kind of noise that seemed to suffocate the air around her. But then, just as she was about to turn it off, something strange happened. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, crept through the static. It was a whisper. Maggie froze, her fingers still on the dial, unsure if she had heard it correctly. She leaned closer, straining to listen. The static crackled, a hiss of white noise filling the room. But beneath it, almost like a voice in the wind, she could make out a few words. "It's coming, it's too late." Her heart skipped a beat. Was that? It couldn't be. She shook her head, brushing it off as her mind playing tricks on her, the result of too many sleepless nights. She turned the dial again, hoping to find something, anything, to distract her. But the static only seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. The whispers continued, now clearer, like a voice speaking just beyond her reach. "Don't listen, don't look." Maggie shuddered, her breath catching in her throat. Her fingers hovered over the dial, but she didn't want to turn it off. Part of her, some primal curiosity, wanted to hear more. She leaned closer, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "They're watching. You're next." A chill ran down her spine. The whisper was clear now, unmistakable. It wasn't just static, it was something else. Something alive. "No," she whispered to herself, her heart pounding. "I'm just tired. I'm imagining things." But even as she spoke, the whispers continued, swirling around her like the dark fog that seemed to hang in the room. They were coming from the radio, but somehow they felt closer, as though they were right beside her. Maggie pulled the blanket tightly around herself, trying to block out the growing sense of unease. Her breathing grew shallow, her chest tightening. She couldn't take her eyes off the radio, her gaze fixed on the dial as though she were waiting for something, anything, to happen. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The static on the radio flickered, and for a moment, the whisper stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, the kind that made her skin crawl. But then, just as suddenly, the static crackled again, and the voice came through, louder this time. "You know me," it said, slow and deliberate. "You've been waiting for me." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She reached for the radio, her hand trembling. She wasn't sure why she hadn't turned it off yet, why she was still listening, still waiting. The voice felt wrong, but it also felt strangely familiar. It was like a part of her, something deep inside her mind, was pulling her toward it. She could almost feel it, this presence, this force pushing her closer and closer. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. The voice didn't answer immediately, but the static crackled with a strange intensity, a low, throbbing hum that reverberated through the room. Maggie closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, but the darkness around her seemed to press in on all sides, suffocating her. And then, the voice came again, low and guttural, like something rising from the depths of the earth. "You will see," it said, the words dragging like nails on a chalkboard. It's already begun. Maggie's heart raced. Her pulse thudded in her ears. What's begun? The radio buzzed with static, and for a moment, she thought she heard laughter, deep and cold, before the voice spoke again. Your future, Maggie. It's all laid out for you. You just need to listen. The room around her seemed to warp, the shadows in the corners of her vision stretching and shifting as though they were alive, watching her. The whispers continued, growing louder, swirling around her like a swarm of bees. Maggie felt a rising panic in her chest, the sense that something was wrong, that she had opened a door she couldn't close. Stop, she pleaded, her voice shaking. Please. I don't want to know. But the voice didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to press closer, its words no longer coming through the radio. It was in her head now, in the very marrow of her bones, a voice that was both foreign and familiar, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The whispers wrapped themselves around her mind, pulling at her thoughts, twisting her perception of reality. You will see it all, Maggie. All the pieces fall into place. The end, the beginning. Maggie's mind raced. She had to turn off the radio. She had to stop listening to it, to whatever this thing was that had attached itself to her. She reached for the dial with shaking hands, her fingers brushing against the cold metal, but as she did, something inside her froze. The voice had stopped. The static had gone silent. And in that silence, something deeper stirred. A presence, dark and suffocating, hung in the air, thickening with every passing second. Maggie held her breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, from the silence, came the voice again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from behind her. Maggie, it whispered, soft and familiar, like a breath against her ear. She whipped around, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dim light from the street lamps outside. But the voice lingered, an invisible force pressing down on her. Maggie, it's time. And in that moment, she understood. There was no escaping it. The whispers, the static, they weren't just predictions. They were a warning. A glimpse into something that was already unfolding. She was not in control anymore. Chapter 2, The Visions. 2.1 The Haunting Clarity. Maggie couldn't sleep after that night. The voice had stayed with her, clinging to her thoughts like a shadow that would not leave. She tried to shake it off, tried to convince herself it was just a byproduct of her insomnia, but deep down, she knew it was something more. Something far more dangerous. Every time she closed her eyes, the words echoed in her mind. You will see. But what was she supposed to see? What was this thing, this presence, trying to show her? The next day, she forced herself to go through the motions, coffee, work, trying to pretend everything was normal. But her mind was a million miles away, trapped in the echo of the radio's whispers. The static still played in her mind like an endless loop, the voice growing louder with each passing minute. As the evening approached, the familiar feeling of dread began to settle in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of another sleepless night or the gnawing feeling that something was about to happen, but it was there, like a storm on the horizon. It was inevitable. She knew that now. By the time she found herself in bed again, the room felt colder than usual. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch further, and the air felt thick, charged with some unseen force. Her breath quickened as she reached for the radio, her fingers trembling. She knew she shouldn't, she had promised herself she wouldn't, but she couldn't resist. The pull was too strong. She turned the dial, and once again, the static filled the room. But this time, it was different. The air vibrated with a strange tension, and the static seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. As Maggie listened, her skin prickled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Then, the voice came. "It's time," it said, as if it had been waiting for her. "The pieces are falling into place." Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of the source of the voice. But there was nothing. Nothing except the static. "You're not alone, Maggie," the voice continued, its tone like velvet, smooth but tainted with something darker. "I've always been here." Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She had heard it before, those words, that voice, but this time there was something different. Something sinister. The whispers seemed to crawl into her mind, twisting her thoughts, blurring the line between what was real and what was not. She felt it again, the overwhelming sense that she was being watched. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "What do you want from me?" The static crackled in response, louder now, as though it were responding to her question, mocking her in some way. And then the voice spoke again, its words slow and deliberate. "You know me," it said, each word sinking deeper into her consciousness. "I am you, Maggie. I am what you've always feared." The room seemed to tilt. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, the edges of her reality began to fade. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more solid, as though they were alive. Her breath became shallow, her pulse racing as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Stop," Maggie pleaded, but her voice barely reached her ears, swallowed by the overwhelming sound of the static. "You can't stop it," the voice said softly, almost soothingly. "It's already happening." Maggie could feel the panic rising in her chest, the suffocating sense of being trapped, of losing control. She could no longer separate the whispers from her own thoughts. The voice was inside her head, inside her skin, twisting her perception of reality. And then, with a sudden clarity that hit her like a bolt of lightning, she saw it. 2.2 The future unfolds. The room around her melted away, and in its place, she was somewhere else, a place that seemed familiar and yet distant. It was a vision, a nightmare wrapped in the folds of her consciousness. She was standing in a dark, empty street, the pavement slick with rain, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced in the wet streets. Maggie's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew this place. She had been here before, or rather, she was going to be here. The vision shifted, and suddenly, she was inside a house, her house, but different. The walls were cracked, the furniture overturned, as if something violent had taken place. The air was thick with dust, the silence oppressive. And then, she saw it, herself, standing in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with fear, staring at something Maggie couldn't see. "Why are you showing me this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What does it mean?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the vision shifted again, faster now, each scene flashing before her eyes like a broken film reel. She saw herself standing by a window, watching a storm rage outside. She saw her reflection in the mirror, but it wasn't her face she saw, it was something darker, something twisted, with hollow eyes and a grotesque smile. The images began to overlap, growing more chaotic. Maggie tried to close her eyes, tried to shut out the visions, but they kept coming. She saw herself standing at the edge of a cliff, staring out into the void. She saw a figure behind her, tall, dark, and looming, its face obscured in shadow. It reached out to her, its hand cold and inhuman. "No!" Maggie cried, but the vision didn't stop. It only grew worse, more violent. She saw herself screaming, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the storm around her. "Help me," she shouted, but the voice only whispered in response. "You will see it all, Maggie," it said, its tone chillingly calm. "It's already written." The vision shattered, and Maggie was back in her room, her heart racing, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was gasping for air, her hands shaking as she reached for the radio. But the whispers were gone now. The room was silent, deathly silent. The static had faded, and she was left in the oppressive quiet, the weight of the vision still heavy in her mind. But it wasn't over. Maggie could feel it. Something was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, waiting to come back. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the future that was unfolding before her, piece by piece. The silence in the room was unbearable, and Maggie's thoughts began to spiral again, the anxiety clawing at her chest. She glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 4:15 a.m. She couldn't sleep. She didn't want to sleep. The moment she closed her eyes, the visions would come again, and she would see more. The voice had warned her, it wasn't over yet. Maggie pulled the blanket around her tightly, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled in her bones. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but she knew deep down that no one could hear her. No one could save her. The voice would be back, and it would show her more. 2.4 A familiar presence. As the hours passed, Maggie could feel her grip on reality slipping further. The room seemed to warp again, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The familiar hum of the streetlights outside had turned into something menacing, a constant drone that filled the air with an unnerving presence. She couldn't stop thinking about the house in her vision. The dark street. The figure in the corner. She could still feel the weight of its eyes on her, even though she was alone in her room. And then, she heard it again. A soft whisper, just beyond her reach. "You're not alone." Maggie's breath hitched in her throat. The voice was back. "You will see it all, Maggie. Everything. The storm is coming." The static returned, louder now, pressing against her eardrums. The room seemed to tilt, spinning out of control, and Maggie could no longer tell where the vision ended and the real world began. It was all slipping away. All of it. And there was no turning back. Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. 3.1 The Reflections Call. Maggie's grip on reality had started to slip. It wasn't just the visions, the unrelenting images of the future that forced their way into her mind every time she closed her eyes. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that she was being pulled into something she couldn't control, something dark that had been waiting for her, lurking just beneath the surface of her life. The whispers had become constant, a background hum that she couldn't escape. No matter where she went, no matter what she did, the static followed her. It was always there, in the corners of her thoughts, creeping in when she wasn't paying attention. When she looked in the mirror now, she didn't recognize the face staring back at her. It wasn't just the exhaustion, it was something deeper. The reflection was too still, too hollow, as though it had become a mask for something else. Something watching her from within. The night had fallen again, and Maggie sat by the window, staring out at the dark streets below. The world seemed too quiet. Even the usual hum of the city was muted, as though it had been swallowed by the static. She could still hear the voice in her head, clear as ever, murmuring its cryptic warnings. "You've seen it, Maggie," it whispered. "The storm is coming. It's almost time." Her hand reached for the radio on the nightstand, but before she could turn the dial, a thought struck her, a thought that made her stomach twist with fear. What if she could see more? What if the static wasn't just showing her the future? What if it was showing her something deeper? Something more sinister? She hesitated. She had been too afraid to listen before. But now, the pull was stronger. The voice in her head urged her on, its words growing louder with each passing minute. "You will know soon," it coaxed. "Don't be afraid." 3.2 The price of knowledge. Maggie turned the dial, and the familiar static filled the room, a soft crackling that seemed to vibrate in the air. The room felt colder, the shadows stretching across the walls, reaching toward her like tendrils. She leaned in closer to the radio, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. "It's here," the voice said, clearer than before, as though it was standing right behind her. "This is the moment. The moment when you will understand." Maggie closed her eyes, her hands trembling as she gripped the radio. The static grew louder, pressing in on her, a physical force that seemed to push her down into the chair. Her chest felt tight, as if the air itself had thickened, turning suffocating. Suddenly, the whisper broke through, sharp and insistent. "Look. Look at the reflection." Maggie's eyes snapped open, and her gaze was drawn immediately to the mirror across the room. The one she had been avoiding, the one she couldn't look at without feeling the weight of the darkness behind it. She didn't want to, but the voice in her head made it impossible to ignore. She rose from the chair, her legs unsteady, and took a hesitant step toward the mirror. The static was now a deafening roar in her ears, drowning out everything else. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding as she reached for the mirror. Her reflection was distorted, no longer just an image of herself, but something else. Something wrong. The figure in the mirror smiled at her, but it wasn't her smile. The eyes staring back at her were hollow, empty, and yet they seemed to know her, know things about her that no one else could. The voice in her head spoke again, its tone chillingly calm. "You've seen what's coming, haven't you? You know what will happen. You can't hide from it." Maggie's breath hitched in her throat. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see more, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the reflection. She felt as if the mirror was pulling her in, as though it were alive, its surface a portal to something darker. The image of herself in the glass shifted, warping, until it was no longer her face staring back. It was a monster. Its features were twisted, its eyes wide with madness, its smile grotesque. The thing in the mirror reached toward her, its hands stretching out, fingers elongating in unnatural ways. "Stop," Maggie gasped, stumbling backward, but the figure in the mirror followed her. It was no longer just a reflection, it was something more. Something that wanted to drag her into the darkness with it. "You can't run," the voice whispered. "You've already seen it. You've already crossed the line." Maggie stumbled away from the mirror, the whispers in her mind growing louder, more frantic. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but the voice was inside her head now, clawing at her thoughts, invading every corner of her mind. "You've seen what's coming, Maggie," it repeated, over and over again, the words like a mantra. "The storm is coming. It's already too late." Maggie collapsed to the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the static in her ears grew deafening. She could feel her mind unraveling, the pieces of her sanity slipping away with every passing second. She could still hear the voice, still feel its presence in the room, its cold fingers tightening around her thoughts. The visions, the whispers, they weren't just warnings. They were a promise. A promise of something that was going to happen, something that had already begun. "You've always known," the voice said, its tone soothing now, as though it were trying to comfort her. "You've always known that this would come. You can't fight fate, Maggie. It's already written." She pressed her hands to her eyes, trying to block out the vision, the reflection, the voice. But it didn't help. It only made it worse. The room around her seemed to spin, the walls closing in as the static filled every corner of her mind. Her breathing became shallow, her vision blurring. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. She could hear it now, the sound of the storm, distant but growing louder. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, the sound growing more intense. She could feel it pressing against her, the force of it, the inevitability of it. "It's coming for you, Maggie," the voice whispered. "It's already here." 3.4 The final choice. Maggie's vision blurred, her head spinning as the room seemed to tilt, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching and shifting. The reflection in the mirror had begun to move, its face warping, becoming more distorted with every passing second. Maggie couldn't look away. The figure in the mirror was smiling at her, its grin growing wider, its eyes dark and empty. The static in the room was now a physical presence, pressing on her from all sides. It was suffocating her, drowning her thoughts, and yet the voice continued, steady and calm. "You can't stop it, Maggie. You've already seen too much. It's too late." She reached for the radio, her hand trembling, but before she could turn the dial, the voice spoke again, louder this time, shaking her to the core. "Are you ready to face it?" Maggie closed her eyes, her mind spinning with fear, with confusion. She didn't know what was real anymore. She didn't know what she was supposed to do. But one thing was clear, the storm was coming, and there was no escaping it. Chapter 4 The Storm. 4.1 The Eye of the Storm. Maggie stood at the edge of herself, trembling, a stranger in her own skin. The whispers had grown unbearable, louder now, as if the very air around her was alive with their presence. The static hummed with a power that vibrated in her bones, and her thoughts felt disjointed, scattered, as if they were being pulled apart piece by piece. The room was spinning, the walls bending in and out of focus as the shadows stretched and crawled across the floor like dark fingers reaching for her. She could feel the presence pressing on her, smothering her, and in the midst of the chaos, she could hear it, the storm. It wasn't a storm outside, not in the physical sense. No, this storm was different. It was a storm inside her mind, inside her soul, a violent, dark force that was slowly consuming everything in its path. The wind howled in her ears, and the sound of distant thunder echoed in the back of her skull. She had seen it. She had seen the storm in her visions, and now it was real. The future she had been warned about, the one that had seemed like a distant nightmare, was unfolding before her eyes. "You're here now," the voice said, its tone oddly comforting, like a lullaby sung in the dark. "This is where it begins. You've always known this moment would come." Maggie clutched her chest, trying to steady her breathing, but it was no use. The storm in her mind was relentless, and the voice, it wouldn't stop. It was inescapable, pressing on her consciousness like an unstoppable wave. "There's nowhere to run," the voice continued. "You're mine now. You've always been mine." 4.2 The Shifting. Maggie turned toward the mirror, her reflection staring back at her, but it wasn't her face. It couldn't be. The figure in the glass was distorted, its features twisted into a grotesque mask of horror. Her reflection grinned at her, its eyes hollow, like dark pits that threatened to swallow her whole. The voice rose in her head, an unholy crescendo that drowned out everything else, each word resonating in her mind like the sound of 1,000 echoes. "This is it, Maggie," the voice said. "This is the moment when you finally understand." The room seemed to tilt, and the reflection in the mirror began to move, shifting like a dark liquid. Maggie felt herself drawn toward it, unable to stop herself. She stumbled forward, her legs shaking beneath her as she reached for the mirror. Her fingers brushed against the cold glass, and a jolt of electricity shot through her body. For a brief moment, everything went still. The whispers, the static, the storm, all of it stopped. And then, the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. The reflection of herself in the glass began to shift, melting into a new form. It wasn't her anymore. The face staring back at her was cold, alien, and yet it was undeniably hers. It smiled. Maggie felt the air grow thick, the temperature plummeting as if the very essence of the world was warping around her. Her breath fogged in front of her, and the whispers returned, louder, frantic, desperate. "The end is here," the voice hissed. "It's too late to stop it." Maggie screamed, her throat raw, but the sound was swallowed by the static, drowned by the overwhelming noise that now filled the room. The reflection in the mirror reached toward her, its fingers stretching out, longer than they should have been, reaching for her soul. "You cannot escape," it whispered. "You never could." Maggie stumbled back, her hands pressed to her ears, but the whispers didn't stop. They were inside her, wrapping themselves around her thoughts, suffocating her. The room had grown darker, and the storm outside, real this time, roared, its fury shaking the walls, rattling the windows. She turned, but the shadows in the room were no longer shadows. They were alive, writhing and shifting in the corners, moving toward her. Maggie's heart raced as she backed away, her eyes wild with terror. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, and the storm in her mind, the storm that had been building for so long, was finally breaking. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, a voice broke through, clear, sharp, and cutting through the static like a knife. "You've already crossed the line." Maggie's eyes snapped open, and she found herself standing in the center of the room, staring at the mirror, her reflection still smiling at her. But this time, the reflection spoke. "You see it now," it said. "You've seen the truth." The room trembled, the floor beneath her feet shifting as though the very foundation of reality was breaking apart. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just her. It was something darker, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. "You are me," the reflection said, its voice not just a whisper, but a roar now. "You have always been me." The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and Maggie felt herself falling into the mirror, into the dark abyss that awaited her. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the storm, by the unrelenting force that had been pulling her toward this moment. And then, everything went silent. 4.4 The Aftermath. When Maggie opened her eyes again, the world was different. The storm had passed, and the room was still. The mirror no longer reflected her. It was empty. The static was gone. She was alone. But was she? Maggie slowly stood, her limbs heavy, as if the very act of standing had become a monumental task. She looked around, but the room was unchanged. The same shadows. The same furniture. It was all the same, and yet everything felt wrong. As if she were no longer a part of it. And then she saw it. Her reflection, no longer in the mirror, but standing behind her, smiling. Maggie didn't scream. She didn't move. Because she knew now. She knew what had been shown to her, what had always been there. She wasn't just a part of the storm. She was the storm. And it was never going to end. Story 3. David had always prided himself on being a creature of habit. His days fell into predictable routines: wake up at 7 a.m., work until 5 p.m., gym, dinner, sleep. His small apartment was his sanctuary, and he liked the quiet solitude of his evenings. There was one thing, though, that always seemed out of place: the feeling that someone was missing. It wasn't just the occasional feeling that someone had been there, a presence lingering in the corners of his mind. It was more than that. It was a slow, creeping unease that had started to take root in his chest over the past few weeks. David had noticed it most nights, when he sat down at his desk to review his work or when he watched TV. The empty chair across from him would remind him of something, a person, a name, but no matter how hard he tried, the memory would always slip away like water through his fingers. It wasn't until the strange incident last week that the feeling began to escalate. He had been folding laundry when he heard a voice. The sound of someone laughing. He froze. The laugh was unmistakable, familiar. It was Nick, his best friend, his old roommate from college. "Hey, you got the new season of that show you love?" Nick had asked one evening, grinning like he always did. David had told him he'd get it the next day. Except Nick wasn't there. David stood there for a moment, laundry forgotten in his hands, looking around the apartment. His breath caught in his throat when he realized the source of the laugh. It had come from the living room, where there was no one. No Nick. David's stomach dropped. He had lived alone for almost a year now. Nick had moved out months ago, but this laugh, it sounded as clear as if Nick had never left. The strange occurrence didn't end there. Over the next few days, memories started to shift and blur. David would find himself recalling moments with Nick, long conversations they'd had about the future, hours spent playing video games, late-night pizza runs, but when he tried to reach out to Nick to talk about these things, it was as if Nick had evaporated. One night, David opened the door to his old roommate's bedroom, intending to fetch a book he'd left behind. His heart skipped a beat when he saw that the room, despite being untouched for months, had changed. The bed was unmade, the clothes strewn about, a half-empty coffee cup sat on the desk. The window was cracked open, and David could have sworn he saw Nick's sneakers by the door, even though he'd been gone for weeks. Confused, David had stepped into the room, checking the closet and the drawers. The space felt wrong, like it was frozen in time, a snapshot of someone who had left but never really gone. When he left the room, he felt the weight of something shifting inside him. A nagging thought, something creeping at the back of his mind, tugging at the fabric of reality. It was subtle but growing stronger. Nick had left, right? He couldn't shake the sense that his memories were turning against him. Details were slipping away, like sand through his fingers. The more David thought about it, the more he began to doubt himself. He would run into people in the building who would casually ask about Nick, and David would smile and nod, trying to act as though everything was normal. "Oh yeah, he moved out," he'd say. But each time, he felt something wasn't right. Had Nick ever really been there? Had he ever been his roommate, his closest friend? That evening, David was sorting through old boxes of photos and letters when his phone rang. He glanced down at the screen, an unfamiliar number. Normally, he'd ignore it, but something made him answer this time. "Hello?" David? Hey, man. It's Nick. David froze. His heart skipped. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, warm, familiar, that laid-back tone Nick always had. His best friend, who had been gone for months, was speaking to him just like he had before. A rush of relief and confusion washed over him all at once. Nick? Where are you? What's going on? Why didn't you call me sooner? David's voice wavered, the weight of the situation settling into his chest. There was a long pause on the other end. David, Nick said, his voice suddenly cold, I haven't been in your life for months. What are you talking about? David's blood ran cold. Nick, don't mess with me. I've been living here alone for a year. You were my roommate. We used to live together. I'm sorry, David, Nick's voice said, distant now, like an echo, but you've been living alone all this time. I haven't been there for a long time. The line went dead. David stared at his phone, his hands trembling. He didn't know whether to laugh or scream. His mind swirled with confusion. Was he losing it? The memories, the laughter, the conversations, had they all been figments of his imagination? Had he been living in a lie? The next few days were a blur of questions and sleepless nights. David began to notice more details he couldn't explain. There was the framed picture of Nick and him at the beach, the one they'd taken during a road trip the previous summer, only now, when David looked at it, Nick's face seemed different. Distorted. The edges of the photo were fraying, curling in a way that looked unnatural, as though it had been handled too many times. The memory of Nick had always been sharp, vivid. But now, it felt like the edges were blurring, like a fading photograph that couldn't quite hold onto its subject. The more David searched for proof, the more holes appeared in his memories. Nick's presence seemed to be evaporating in real time. One evening, David sat in the living room, staring at the TV, but his mind was somewhere else. He glanced at the old couch where they used to sit together, laughing and watching movies. A strange sensation washed over him, the feeling that he was being watched, observed by something he couldn't see. And then, the lights flickered. For a brief moment, everything went black. When the lights came back on, David felt a chill run down his spine. The couch, the room, everything felt different. And that's when he saw it. The door to Nick's old room was wide open. And for the first time in months, the faint smell of his old cologne, woodsy and musk, drifted through the air. Nick? David whispered, his voice barely audible. But there was no answer. David couldn't escape the growing sense that something was wrong. His every move seemed to be guided by invisible strings, strings that were fraying and unraveling with each passing day. The days dragged on, but his sense of reality felt more fragile with each passing hour. Nick, his best friend, had been a fixture of his life for years. But now, David couldn't shake the feeling that Nick had never truly been there at all. He spent the next few days retracing his steps, trying to hold on to the memories that once felt so real. The memories of laughing with Nick in their old college apartment, of going on spontaneous trips, of sharing secrets late at night, they were all fading like a half-forgotten dream. He could no longer trust his own mind. The more he tried to recall the past, the more details slipped away. He could barely remember the last time Nick had been in his apartment, let alone the specifics of their last conversation. Every corner of the apartment felt foreign. The familiar creaks of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the hum of the streetlights outside, all of it seemed to pulse with a strange energy that David couldn't quite explain. It was as if something, or someone, was missing, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Then came the dream. David had always been a restless sleeper, but this dream was different. The edges of the dream world were sharp, too sharp, like a photograph that had been printed too clearly. In the dream, he was sitting in the living room, the one he shared with Nick for so long, when suddenly, the door to Nick's room creaked open. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the streetlights that leaked in from the window. And there, standing in the doorway, was Nick. But something was wrong. His face was twisted, blurry, as if it were made of shadows and smoke. "David," the dream version of Nick said, his voice muffled, as though it was being filtered through water. "I've always been here, David. Haven't I?" David tried to speak, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward him as if they were trying to swallow him whole. And then, just as quickly as it began, the dream shifted. The darkness consumed Nick's figure, and David was left alone in the room, the oppressive silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. He awoke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, the dream lingered in the corners of his mind, making it hard to distinguish where the dream ended and reality began. He had to blink a few times to clear his vision, as though waking up from the dead of night, but the unease remained. The line between the waking world and the world inside his mind had blurred. 2.2 The distorted evidence. The next morning, David found himself compelled to go through Nick's old things. He hadn't done it before, hadn't even thought about it since Nick had moved out, but something inside him pushed him to open the closet, the drawers, and sift through the remnants of their time together. What he found didn't help. It made everything worse. Nick's things were still there, clothes, books, half-empty coffee cups. But everything felt wrong. The bookshelves looked oddly bare, and there were no photos, no remnants of their shared moments, like they had been erased from existence. The more he searched, the more David noticed how incomplete it all was. As he sat on the floor surrounded by the remnants of Nick's life, the smell of his cologne suddenly filled the air. David froze. His mind screamed for clarity, but there was only silence. The scent was so familiar, so distinctly Nick's, that for a moment it felt like the man himself had just walked into the room. He stood up suddenly, panic rising in his chest. He spun around to look at the room, trying to locate the source of the scent, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, just as it had been the last time he checked. He had to get out. The walls were closing in on him, and the sense of something creeping just out of sight was too much to bear. He rushed out of Nick's room, slamming the door behind him, and leaned against the wall, trying to calm his breathing. He closed his eyes, trying to ground himself, but when he opened them, he found something that stopped his heart. In the hallway mirror, his reflection was different. It wasn't just a subtle shift. His reflection was smiling back at him, but the smile wasn't his. It was someone else's. It was Nick. David stepped back, his breath shallow. The reflection in the mirror faded, and his own face returned to its usual, familiar features. But the image of Nick's face, twisted and distorted in that moment, lingered in his mind. He stumbled away from the mirror and out of the apartment into the quiet streets below. The air was cold, and he felt a deep sense of isolation, as though the world around him had become a facade, a hollow shell of what it used to be. His mind was a tangled mess, and he didn't know where to turn. 2.3 The phone call returns. David needed answers. He needed to know if any of this, Nick's presence, the distorted memories, the reflections, was real. But as he reached for his phone, ready to call Nick, his fingers froze on the screen. The number he had dialed before was saved in his contacts, but something felt off. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, the weight of indecision pressing on his chest. He dialed it anyway. Ring. 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 The phone line clicked, and then a voice answered. David, Nick's voice said, but it didn't sound like Nick. It sounded hollow, distant, as if it was coming from far away. I told you not to call. Didn't I? David's blood turned cold. Nick? Is this really you? The voice on the other end let out a dry laugh. You know who I am, David. But the question is, who are you? The line went dead. David's mind raced. The cold grip of dread tightened around his chest. Something was wrong. Nick's voice, his presence, it felt like a shadow, a distortion. The man who had been his friend, his roommate, had he ever really existed? David's head swam with the weight of it all, his thoughts spiraling out of control. He needed to know what was happening. He needed answers, but every door he tried to open seemed to lead to more questions. The reality he had built for himself, the memories of laughter and friendship, all seemed to be dissolving before his eyes, replaced by something far darker and more sinister. The final straw came when David went back to Nick's room that evening, determined to gather all the evidence he could. But when he opened the door, he found something even more chilling. The room was completely empty. Everything was gone, the clothes, the books, the coffee cups, the remnants of their shared life. It was as if Nick had never been there at all. Even the smell of his cologne had vanished. David stood in the doorway, staring at the empty space. His breath caught in his throat. Had it all been a lie? Had Nick ever been real? He reached for the light switch, but as his fingers brushed the switch, something caught his eye. On the floor, just beneath the bed, was a single photograph. It was crumpled, the edges torn, but when David picked it up, his heart skipped a beat. It was a picture of Nick and him at graduation, arms around each other, grinning like idiots. But in the corner, where Nick's face should have been, there was only a blur. David's hand trembled as he stared at the photo, feeling the weight of reality shifting beneath him. And then, in the silence of the empty room, the whispers returned. A voice, so soft, so faint, whispered in his ear. You've forgotten, David. You've forgotten everything. David's mind was a maze, each thought spiraling into the next. The photo in his hand, the empty room, the cold laugh that had echoed through his phone, it was all too much to process. His life, once grounded in concrete memories, now felt like a house of cards, fragile and ready to collapse. He had to find answers. He had to know if he was losing his mind or if something much more sinister was happening. That afternoon, David drove to the one place he thought might provide some answers, the old college campus. He and Nick had spent 4 years there, roommates in a small, cramped apartment that had once felt like home. Surely, someone there would remember Nick, someone would have proof he had existed. The campus was eerily quiet as David wandered through the familiar pathways, the trees swaying in the wind, their branches creaking. He found himself in the library, the place where he and Nick had studied countless nights, cramming for exams and talking about their future. David approached the front desk, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. He cleared his throat, a nervous tension clenching his stomach. "Excuse me," he said, his voice unsteady. "I'm looking for information about a student who used to be here. Nick Harper." The librarian, an elderly woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, looked up at him with a vague expression. "Nick Harper," she repeated, her tone flat. "I'm afraid I don't recognize that name." David felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. "Are you sure?" He was my roommate for years. We graduated together." The librarian's expression remained unchanged. She shuffled through a few papers in front of her, her fingers pausing over a list of names. "I don't see anyone by that name here, sir." "Are you certain about the details?" David swallowed, his throat dry. Yeah, I'm sure. He was on the football team." The words trailed off as he searched his mind for more details, but it felt as if the memory was slipping away, too. He could barely remember Nick's face now, the shape of his smile, the sound of his laugh. The librarian gave him a polite but distant smile. "I'm afraid you may be mistaken. There's no record of anyone named Nick Harper attending here. Perhaps you should check with your former classmates." "It's been years." David stood frozen in place. The air around him seemed to thicken, pressing against his chest. He could feel the walls of his world closing in. He needed to leave. He had to get out of there. "Thank you," he muttered, forcing a smile before turning and walking quickly out of the library. The campus stretched before him like a cold, indifferent maze, each building, each shadow, mocking him with its emptiness. David returned home in a daze, the cold creeping up his spine, each step heavier than the last. The apartment felt more like a tomb than a home. His own footsteps echoed through the halls, the silence settling in his bones like lead. He stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the empty chair across from him. The chair that used to be Nick's. It was absurd. The whole situation felt absurd. His best friend, the person he had shared his life with, was nothing but a ghost, a figment of his own mind. He glanced at the mirror near the hallway. For the first time, the reflection of his own face seemed foreign. The lines under his eyes seemed deeper, as though time itself had been stretched and distorted. His own features, once so familiar, seemed to mock him. He approached the mirror, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. His reflection moved in time with him, but there was something unsettling about it. His fingers hovered above the glass, but something caught his eye, something in the reflection. Behind him, standing in the doorway of the living room, was a figure. David spun around, but the room was empty. He looked back at the mirror. There it was again, the figure, only this time it wasn't just a shadow. It was Nick. The same figure, standing just beyond his reach. David's heart thudded in his chest. "Nick?" David's voice cracked. He could hardly believe the words were leaving his mouth. The figure in the reflection moved slightly, tilting its head in a way that was eerily familiar. The smile, that same grin, crept onto its face. David stepped back, his hands shaking. "No. This isn't real," he muttered, trying to steady himself. But the figure didn't fade. It was still there, as if waiting for him. He could no longer tell where the real world ended and the nightmare began. The reflection was no longer just an image, it was an entity, watching him, waiting. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward in the mirror, its smile widening impossibly wide. "You've always known I was here," Nick's voice said, but it wasn't just Nick's voice. It was distorted, hollow, like something trying to mimic him. The voice echoed in the air around David, swirling around his ears until it felt like it was coming from every direction. No, David gasped, his mind reeling. This isn't possible. The figure in the mirror spoke again, its voice colder this time. It's not about what's possible, David. It's about what you've forgotten. David stumbled back, his breath ragged. He could move. The reflection was alive. It was real, wasn't it? Who are you? David whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure in the mirror didn't answer. Instead, it stepped out of the frame, its form rippling, and before David knew it, the thing was standing behind him. He could feel it there, its presence like an invisible weight on his shoulders. A cold hand, or something like it, pressed against his back. Do you remember now? The voice whispered, close to his ear. Do you remember, David? David's vision blurred as the world around him began to spin. He reached for the wall to steady himself, but it felt like the very fabric of reality was coming undone. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The images, the whispers, they were all bleeding together, merging into something he couldn't escape. And then, the truth came crashing down. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. Nick had never existed. David's heart stopped. His breath hitched in his chest as the weight of the thought suffocated him. He had built his entire life on memories of someone who had never been real. The figure in the mirror, Nick, or whatever it was, smiled again, but this time it wasn't just a smile. It was a sneer, a mocking expression that made David's blood run cold. It wasn't just the mirror that was empty, it was David's entire life, his past, his future, all empty, all constructed from illusions. You've been alone, David, the voice whispered. All along. David collapsed to his knees, his mind racing. He had been living in a false reality. The room, the pictures, the laughter, they were all fragments of his own mind, a twisted reflection of what he had wanted, what he had needed to believe. Nick had never been there. He had never been his friend. The walls closed in around him, and the whispers began to grow louder again, this time, not just from the mirror, but from every corner of the room. The room that had once felt safe now felt like a prison. You've forgotten, the voice hissed, louder now. And you will never remember again. David's mind snapped. The truth was too much to bear. He stood up shakily, unable to look at the mirror, unable to face the figure that wasn't there but still haunted him. He could feel it, creeping at the edge of his vision, waiting for him to fall into the darkness. No, he whispered, his hands gripping his head as if to hold it together. No, this isn't real. None of this is real. The mirror flickered. The room flickered. Reality itself seemed to be slipping from his grasp, like sand through his fingers. And then, everything went dark. Story 4. Sophie had always prided herself on the simplicity of her life. She lived in a small, quiet apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building in the heart of the city, surrounded by familiar faces and everyday routines. She liked her routine: wake up at 6:30 a.m., coffee by 7 o'clock, work at the publishing house until 5 p.m., then home to read, cook, or sometimes do nothing at all. It was peaceful, predictable, and above all, comfortable. But on the morning of the 23rd of April, everything changed. Sophie awoke to a small, unmarked envelope resting on her doorstep. No stamp. No return address. Just her name, written in flowing cursive that seemed oddly familiar. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as some junk mail or misplaced letter, but something inside her stirred as she bent down to pick it up. The paper was thick, the kind used for formal letters, and it had a faint, almost imperceptible scent to it, something like old books and wood smoke. She turned it over, expecting to find some corporate logo or a name, but there was nothing. She stood there, staring at the envelope, unsure of what to do. There was something about it that made her feel uneasy, yet intrigued. With a deep breath, she tore open the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was neat, precise, and once again, strangely familiar. It read, "Dearest Sophie, I trust this letter finds you well, but I know you may not recognize my name at first. You've forgotten much, but I am here to remind you. A life that you should have lived, but somehow you never did. The pieces are scattered, but I will help you put them together. The first step is this letter. The second, I will send tomorrow. Yours truly, someone who knows you well." Sophie's hands trembled as she read the letter. It didn't make sense. Who could have sent this? And why did it feel like it was meant for her, even though she didn't recognize the handwriting? She shook her head, brushing off the strange sense of déjà vu that washed over her. Her mind couldn't help but spin with confusion, but she decided not to dwell on it too much. After all, it could just be some elaborate prank or marketing gimmick. But as she crumpled the letter and tossed it into the trash, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, she felt a stirring in her chest, a nagging sense of familiarity that made her feel as though she had just opened a door to something she didn't understand. Something she shouldn't be understanding. 1.2 The second letter. The following evening, Sophie found herself sitting on her couch, staring blankly at the TV, unable to focus on the show she was watching. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the letter. Who had sent it? Why her? The more she tried to push it out of her mind, the more it lingered like a shadow. Around 7 p.m., just as she was about to make dinner, there was another knock at her door. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw another envelope on the floor. It was exactly like the first one, no name, no stamp, just her name in that familiar cursive handwriting. Her pulse quickened as she picked it up, her fingers trembling once more. She had to know who was behind this. She had to know why. Without thinking, she opened it immediately. The letter inside was short, but the words seemed to chill her to the bone. Dearest Sophie, I see you've already forgotten the first letter. How typical. Don't worry, though. The pieces are coming together now, one by one. Look to your past. The memories you've buried, especially the one with the blue door. I will be waiting. Yours truly, someone who knows you well. Sophie read the letter over and over, trying to understand what it meant. The blue door, she muttered under her breath, the words unfamiliar yet somehow haunting. She had no memory of a blue door. What could it possibly mean? She sat in silence for a long moment, her heart thudding in her chest. There was something in the back of her mind, something just out of reach, that seemed to echo with the letter's words. She could almost see it, a door, a shade of blue she couldn't quite place, standing in a hallway. But the image was fleeting, like a shadow that disappeared the moment she tried to focus on it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Sophie stood up quickly, startled by the sudden sound. She had just received the second letter. What could possibly be next? Her mind raced, her anxiety swelling in her chest. She slowly approached the door and opened it. No one was there. Instead, there was a small, crumpled piece of paper wedged between the doorframe and the wall. Her heart skipped again as she bent down to pick it up. The handwriting was the same, familiar but unnerving. It read, "You're closer than you think. It's all been waiting for you." There was no signature this time, no clues. Only the chilling message. Sophie felt a wave of nausea ripple through her, a cold sweat breaking out along her back. What was happening to her? Why was she being drawn into this strange puzzle? The next few days were a blur of confusion and frustration. Sophie couldn't focus on her work. The letters haunted her thoughts, and the cryptic messages seemed to follow her wherever she went. She started to search her apartment for any hint of a blue door, but nothing made sense. It was as though she were being led down a path to a memory that didn't exist. One afternoon, as she sifted through old family albums, she stumbled upon something that made her stop dead in her tracks, a photograph. It was a picture of her as a child, standing in front of a blue door, a door she didn't recognize. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. The memory rushed forward, though it was distorted, out of focus. She could almost hear the laughter of children in the background, but it was faint, like an echo. It was in that moment that Sophie understood. She had lived a life, one she had forgotten. A life where there was a blue door, a door that was somehow important, somehow tied to her past. But why couldn't she remember it fully? Why had it been buried, locked away? The truth gnawed at her. It felt as though the universe itself was whispering to her, pushing her towards something she wasn't ready to face. 1 point for the third letter. That night, as Sophie lay in bed, her mind swirling with questions, she heard the softest sound, a rustling at her window. She sat up, her heart pounding. There, pressed against the glass, was the third letter. It was crumpled, almost as if it had been thrown in frustration. She took a deep breath before she opened it. The message inside was short, but it sent a chill down her spine. "You've remembered, Sophie. The door is waiting. The life you never lived is waiting. Come, and you will see it all." Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she read the words. They were the same words she had whispered to herself as a child, back in that moment, in front of the blue door. It was all starting to unravel. The moment Sophie read the third letter, something inside her shifted. The words on the page weren't just ink, they were a key, unlocking a memory she had buried deep within herself. It was almost as if a door inside her mind had opened, and something long forgotten began to seep out. She had been young, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a door. It was a blue door, faded by time but unmistakable in her mind's eye. There had been laughter, a warm, golden light spilling through the cracks, and a feeling of comfort that made her feel safe. She could remember the texture of the paint, the way the air around the door smelled, dusty, a little musty, but comforting in its own way. But as quickly as the memory surfaced, it slipped away. The more Sophie tried to focus on it, the more it danced just beyond her reach, like trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. Her head throbbed, and she pressed her palm to her forehead, trying to steady herself. She had to know more. She had to find that door. Her pulse quickened as she stood from the couch, suddenly restless. The apartment, her apartment, felt like a prison, the walls closing in on her. There was a place she needed to go, a place that felt strangely familiar, though she couldn't explain why. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed her coat, her keys, and headed out the door. Her instincts guided her, and soon she found herself standing on the familiar streets of her neighborhood. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to find the door. The night was cold, but Sophie didn't feel the chill. Her mind was buzzing with questions, her thoughts scattered like 1,000 pieces of a broken puzzle. She walked aimlessly, her feet carrying her down streets she had walked 100 times before, But tonight, everything felt different. The world around her was distorted, just out of focus, like she was living in someone else's memory. As she turned down a quiet street, something made her stop in her tracks. There, at the end of the block, was an old house, one she had passed by countless times. It wasn't anything special, just a run-of-the-mill building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the house felt like it was calling her, drawing her in. Sophie stood there for a moment, staring at the house. The windows were dark, the door closed, but she could feel it, a presence, something in the air that made her skin prickle. She walked toward it, each step feeling heavier, as if the earth beneath her feet was growing more solid, more real with each movement. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The cold doorknob was slick under her fingertips as she turned it, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside smelled old, dusty, like time had forgotten this place. It felt strangely familiar, as though she had been here before, though she couldn't remember when or why. There was a quiet whisper in the air, a soft voice that seemed to call her name. Sophie. She stepped inside, drawn forward by an invisible force, and her eyes fell upon the room ahead of her. It was exactly as she remembered it, exactly as it had been in her memory. The blue door. It stood in the far corner of the room, untouched by time, its faded paint gleaming faintly in the dim light. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the door she had been searching for. The door to her forgotten past. Sophie's legs trembled as she approached the door. She reached out to touch the handle, but something made her pause. The air around the door felt heavy, oppressive, as if it were alive, waiting for her. Her hand hovered just above the knob, and for a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at it. It was as if the door was a threshold, a boundary between two worlds, two versions of herself. One life, the one she had always known, and the other, the one she had forgotten. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had to know what was on the other side. She had to know what she had left behind. With a sudden, almost involuntary movement, Sophie turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. As the door swung wide, she stepped through. The room beyond the door was small, cramped, but it felt intimate, familiar. There was a bed in the corner, a dresser, a small window that let in a sliver of moonlight. It looked like a child's room, simple and bare, with a faint feeling of nostalgia hanging in the air. But the most striking feature was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, reflecting Sophie's image in the dim light. As she stepped closer to it, she saw that her reflection was different. Her face was younger, her eyes wide with curiosity. She was wearing a dress, a white dress, one she had worn as a child, a dress she had forgotten about until now. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cool surface of the glass. The reflection smiled back at her, but it wasn't just a smile. It was a knowing smile, as though the reflection knew something she didn't. Suddenly, the room felt colder, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Sophie's breath quickened, and she turned to look around the room. There was a sound now, a low murmur, coming from the shadows. It was the same voice she had heard before, the one that had whispered her name. Sophie. The whisper grew louder, and Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. She spun around, looking for the source of the sound, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the mirror. Then, the whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. You've forgotten. Sophie stumbled back from the mirror, her breath ragged, her mind racing. She could feel the pieces of her memory falling into place, but they were fractured, incomplete, like shards of glass that couldn't be put back together. She remembered the room, the door, the dress, but she couldn't remember who had lived here. Why had she been here? The air grew heavier, and Sophie's thoughts began to blur again, the lines between reality and memory slipping away. She turned and ran for the door, but as she reached for the knob, she felt something cold, like a hand, grip her wrist. She spun around, but there was no one behind her. The room was empty. The mirror was gone. The door slammed shut behind her, and the house seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls folding inward like paper. Sophie's breath came in gasps as she struggled to understand what was happening. The voice was still there, still echoing in her mind, but it was different now, colder. "You can't escape, Sophie. You never left. You never will." The door to the room remained closed, locked, a barrier between Sophie and whatever had been waiting on the other side. The truth was slipping away again, but this time Sophie understood. The door had always been there, and she had always known it. Sophie's apartment felt colder than usual. The walls, once comforting, now seemed to press in around her, suffocating her with their oppressive silence. She had been back for hours after leaving the strange house, but the world outside her apartment felt unreal. Every corner seemed too familiar and too foreign at the same time. The door, the blue door, had been real. The room behind it, the mirror, the whispers, they were all real. She knew this now. She couldn't deny it. And yet, the more she tried to understand, the more everything slipped through her fingers like sand. The events of that night haunted her thoughts, the echoes of the voice still lingering in her ears. "You never left," it had whispered, the words cutting through her like a cold wind. She had gone to that room, stepped through the door, and felt the weight of her forgotten past pressing down on her. But what did it all mean? Sophie sat on the couch, staring at the blank wall, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of memories and visions. The mirror in that room, it had shown her a reflection of herself as a child. But it wasn't just a reflection, it had been a glimpse into a life that she hadn't lived, a life she didn't remember, yet somehow knew. It wasn't possible. No one could live two lives. But what if she had? What if the person she had always been was just an echo of something else, something that had been lost to her? The thought was maddening, and Sophie couldn't shake it. Her mind was unraveling, and every moment felt like a step further into the unknown. The letters had come again, each one a reminder of something she had buried deep inside. But these letters weren't just written words. They were pieces of a puzzle that Sophie had been too scared to solve. Each one seemed to pull her further into a world she didn't understand. And then there was the photograph. She had found it that morning, tucked away in one of her old photo albums. It was a picture of her and a man, standing in front of a house, their arms around each other. The man's face was partially obscured, but the memory felt too close, too familiar. She had stared at the picture for hours, but the more she looked at it, the more it felt wrong. She couldn't remember the man's face, even though the picture seemed to scream at her, as if she should know him. Her stomach churned. Who was he? The day passed in a blur, and Sophie found herself back at the house where the blue door had stood. She wasn't sure why she went. Something in her mind had been telling her to return, to seek out the answers that had been locked away. But the more she tried to remember, the further those answers seemed to drift. When she arrived at the house, the door was shut, just as it had been the night before. But now, it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it were alive, calling to her. Sophie approached slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. It was warm, almost as if the house had been waiting for her. She turned the knob and stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and aged wood filling her senses. The house felt different now, darker, heavier. The air seemed thick with something she couldn't name, a presence that had been there all along but had only now begun to make itself known. The room that once held the blue door was gone, replaced by an empty hallway. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust. The mirror, the one that had shown her reflection as a child, was no longer there. Instead, there was a door, but this one was different. Its wood was dark, scarred, as though it had been weathered by years of use. Sophie hesitated for a moment, but something inside her urged her to move forward. She stepped toward the door, her breath shallow. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she reached for the handle. The moment her hand made contact with the cold metal, the air around her seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, and Sophie's vision blurred. The world spun, and she stumbled backward, crashing into the wall. Her breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open by itself. She had no control. It felt as if the door had opened her, as if the space behind it was calling her, pulling her in. She could hear the whispers again, soft at first, but growing louder. "Sophie, you are home." Sophie stepped through the door, her mind racing. The room beyond it was different from the one she had remembered. It wasn't the same child's room, it was bigger, more ornate. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the windows were open, letting in the cool night air. There was a desk in the corner, papers scattered across it, some photographs of people she didn't recognize. She approached the desk, her hand shaking. One photograph caught her eye. It was a picture of the same man from the photo she had found earlier. But now, the man's face was clear. It was a man she didn't know, but who she somehow felt connected to. She stared at the photograph for what seemed like an eternity, but when she looked away, she saw something else in the room, something she hadn't noticed before. The door to a closet was open slightly, and through the gap, she could see the faint outline of something, a figure. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She moved toward the closet slowly, fear and anticipation warring in her chest. When she pushed the door open, her stomach turned. Inside was an old chest, its wood withered and worn. She opened it without thinking, her hands working faster than her mind could process. Inside the chest was something wrapped in cloth. She pulled it free, revealing an old, faded journal. The leather cover was cracked, the edges frayed with age. Sophie opened the journal, her heart pounding as she scanned the first few pages. The handwriting inside was hers, unmistakably her own, but the words made no sense. The entries described events she didn't remember living, memories of a life she couldn't place. One entry, in particular, caught her eye. "I remember the door. The blue door. I've always known it would come for me. But I'm not ready. I don't want to know what's on the other side." The words echoed in her mind, and the room seemed to tilt as the truth hit her all at once. The life she had been living, the one she had thought was her reality, it wasn't hers at all. Sophie slammed the journal shut, her mind reeling. She staggered back from the chest, her thoughts crashing together. The whispers, the memories, the door, it was all part of something bigger, something that she was only beginning to understand. The life she thought was hers had never truly been lived. Sophie turned toward the door, but before she could move, the world around her shifted. The room around her began to fade, and the floor seemed to drop away beneath her feet. The darkness took over, swallowing her whole. When Sophie opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. The journal, the house, the door, they were gone, as if they had never existed. But the truth remained. She could still hear the whispers, still feel the pull of that other life. The blue door was always there, waiting for her. Sophie sat motionless on her couch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her apartment was eerily still, yet the hum of something unseen filled the air. The world outside the window was quiet, as if waiting for something to happen. Sophie's mind raced, a million questions crashing through her thoughts, none of them making sense. Was she losing her mind? Had everything, the blue door, the house, the journal, been nothing more than a dream? No. She couldn't shake the feeling that the door was real, that it had been real, and it was waiting for her. She had already stepped through it, hadn't she? But now, she was back in her apartment, as if nothing had changed. The quiet seemed to suffocate her. The whispers, those haunting voices that had followed her from that strange room, were still there, lingering just beneath the surface. Sophie felt them brush against her consciousness, tugging at the edges of her mind. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing, trying to hold on to something solid in the midst of the storm that was her thoughts. The life she had been living, the one she thought was her own, was nothing but an illusion, a construct of some twisted memory. The life she had forgotten, the life that had been hidden from her, was real. And it was waiting. Her thoughts flashed back to the letter she had received, the first one. The words had been simple, but they had held a message that felt like a warning, a life that you should have lived, but somehow you never did. Sophie stood up abruptly, her mind made up. She wasn't going to hide from this anymore. She had to go back to the house. She had to face whatever waited for her behind that blue door. She had to find the truth. By the time Sophie reached the street, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The city seemed quieter than usual, the streets empty, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She walked quickly, her steps quickening with each passing moment, driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain. She knew the way by heart, though she had never consciously walked this path before. Her feet carried her effortlessly, as if the streets themselves knew where she was headed. She turned a corner, and there it was, the old house. It was just as it had been before, standing there like a forgotten relic from another time, but now it felt different. It felt like a place she belonged, like something waiting for her to return. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorbell, but before she could press it, the door creaked open on its own. Sophie stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, and the floorboards creaked under her feet as she moved deeper into the house. The hallway seemed to stretch before her, endless, like it was pulling her towards something she couldn't see, but she knew what waited ahead. The blue door. It called to her. When Sophie reached the door, she didn't hesitate. She didn't need to check the knob. She didn't need to question if she was ready. She knew, deep in her bones, that this was where she belonged. This was where the truth lay. She turned the handle and pushed it open. The room beyond the door was just as it had been in her memory, just as it had been when she first stepped through it. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the dim light from the window casting long shadows on the floor. The desk was still in the corner, papers scattered across it. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air. But now, Sophie saw something else. The mirror. The one she had seen before, the one that had shown her the reflection of her younger self. It was there, but this time it didn't just reflect her image. It reflected something else. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer to the mirror. The reflection staring back at her was not her own. It was a different version of herself, a version that she didn't recognize. Her face was older, her eyes darker, as if they had seen things Sophie herself had never experienced. The woman in the mirror smiled, a knowing smile, one that Sophie could feel deep in her chest, as if it were a memory she had lived but couldn't remember. "It's time," the woman in the mirror whispered, her voice not quite Sophie's, but not entirely someone else's either. "You've finally come home." Sophie's pulse quickened as she reached out toward the mirror. Her hand trembled as she touched the glass, and the moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to dissolve. The walls around her vanished, and she was no longer standing in the room with the blue door. She was in a new place, a new reality. Sophie gasped as the world around her shifted, her surroundings warping like a broken dream. She was standing in a different room now, a place she didn't recognize, yet it felt like she had been here before. The furniture was old but comforting, the walls painted in warm colors. A fireplace crackled softly, and the smell of something sweet filled the air. But the strangest thing was the woman sitting in front of her. The woman who looked like Sophie, but older, more confident, with a warmth in her eyes that Sophie didn't recognize. She was holding a cup of tea, her lips curving into a gentle smile as she watched Sophie with quiet understanding. "It's been a long time," the woman said softly, her voice the same as the one from the mirror. "You've forgotten everything, haven't you?" Sophie stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What? Who are you?" The woman's smile widened. "I am you. A version of you. The version you were supposed to be." The words hit Sophie like a tidal wave. The life she thought she had lived, the life she had always known, none of it had been real. This woman, the one in front of her, was the person Sophie was meant to be. The memories, the experiences, the life, everything had been a lie. Sophie had been living in a shell, a false version of herself, trapped in a life that wasn't hers. The woman stood up and walked towards Sophie, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sophie flinched at the touch, but the woman only smiled again, her eyes filled with sadness. "You didn't remember, Sophie. You couldn't. But now you do," she said. "You've always known, deep down. And now you're here." Sophie's mind was spinning. She looked around the room, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and realization. She had been living a life that wasn't hers, trapped in a memory, an illusion. The blue door had been the gateway to this truth, to the life she had never lived but somehow always remembered. "You'll be free now," the woman said, her voice soft but final. "You can finally leave the past behind." But as Sophie turned to look at the door, the blue door, it began to close. Slowly, quietly, the door creaked shut, and with it, everything she had thought was real faded away. The warmth of the room, the comfort of the fire, the face of the woman, all of it slipped through her fingers like sand. Sophie stood alone in the dark, the room gone, the truth slipping away once more. And as she stared into the emptiness, she heard the faintest whisper. "You'll never truly leave." Story 5. The cheap hotel in the back streets of the city wasn't the type of place you'd expect someone to stay for more than one night, but for Jack, it was perfect. His business trip had taken him to this part of town, far from the polished, corporate towers, and the hotel's dull facade matched his mood perfectly, tired, worn, and devoid of expectation. The room itself was nothing special. It smelled faintly of mildew, and the peeling wallpaper gave it a faded, tired look. But Jack didn't mind. He was here to work, to catch up on emails and clear his mind. His exhaustion from a day of meetings made the bed a welcome comfort. After all, he only needed a place to sleep and a few hours of quiet before the next grind of his endless corporate life. He sat down on the bed and flicked on the small, vintage TV mounted on the wall. The screen came alive with static, flickering between channels that seemed to offer nothing but nonsense. With a sigh, Jack turned the TV off and tossed the remote on the nightstand. The room was so still, so empty, that the silence seemed almost oppressive. As he got up to unpack his bag, something caught his eye. At the far end of the room, near the corner by the window, a door stood, its width slightly darkened by age. It wasn't there when he first entered. Jack could have sworn it wasn't. The room, when he had first entered, had only a small closet and the bathroom. But now there was another door. It wasn't just the presence of it that unsettled Jack, it was the fact that he hadn't noticed it before. The room was small, no more than a couple of meters across, and yet the door had slipped into his awareness as if it had always been there. It was strange, something about the door felt wrong, but Jack couldn't put his finger on why. He walked toward it, the floor creaking under his weight as he approached the unfamiliar portal. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to invite curiosity. Jack's hand hovered over the handle, but he hesitated. Something about it felt off, too out of place in this otherwise mundane hotel room. After a moment, he turned the handle and opened the door. But when he did, there was nothing behind it. Just a dark, empty wall. Jack blinked, his heart skipping a beat. There was no hallway, no room beyond it. Just bare plaster. He closed the door, his breathing a little heavier than usual. What the hell was going on? Was he imagining things? Could he have somehow missed the door when he first came in? The light from the window made the space seem strangely warped, like the shadows themselves were moving across the room. He shook his head, trying to shake off the unease. Deciding to dismiss it, Jack sat back down on the bed. Maybe the fatigue was starting to play tricks on him. He opened his laptop, focusing on the work that awaited him, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling the door had left behind. But, after a while, Jack couldn't help it. His gaze wandered to the corner, and sure enough, the door was back in place, standing silently as if nothing had ever happened. The door stood there for hours, nothing more than a fixture in the room, like a forgotten detail. Yet Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time he looked at it, a shiver ran down his spine. It felt like the room was watching him. He tried to focus on work, tried to ignore the increasing discomfort in his chest. The hum of the overhead light seemed to get louder, the air thicker. There was something about the door that was like a scratch in his mind. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Jack decided to get up and inspect it again, hoping to rid himself of the nagging thoughts. He stood up from the bed, walking over to the door in the corner once more. His hand was almost shaking as he reached for the handle. There was a part of him, deep down, that didn't want to know what lay behind it. The door creaked as it opened, revealing the dark wall once again. Jack's breath hitched. There was nothing at all, except the bare plaster. He backed away, trying to steady his nerves, but then the oddest thing happened. The door shut by itself. It was an eerie, deliberate sound, the kind that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jack stood frozen, his eyes glued to the door. He could have sworn that when he opened it, it had not been that solid. He was sure there had been a draft, some resistance, as if the door wasn't supposed to be there. But now, it was shut tight, as if it had always been that way. He hesitated for a long moment, staring at it, before forcing himself to turn around and sit back on the bed. The feeling of being watched intensified, the shadows in the room growing thicker with every passing second. He tried to calm himself, to convince his mind that it was just a trick, but something deep inside told him that it wasn't. The door wasn't just some random feature in the room. It was a presence, a weight, a riddle that demanded an answer. The door began to haunt Jack, not just during the night, but every time he entered the room. It became a focal point of his every waking moment. The moment he would walk into the hotel room, he immediately looked for it, hoping that it would stay hidden or vanish. But it never did. And when he wasn't looking, that's when it would appear, always in the corner of his eye, always right where it wasn't supposed to be. By the second night, the door had begun to make its presence known with increasing frequency. Sometimes, it would be there when he entered the room, other times, it would vanish entirely, as if it were never part of the space at all. Jack couldn't sleep. He had tried everything, reading, watching TV, even taking a hot shower to calm his nerves, but the constant feeling of dread gnawed at him. It wasn't just the door itself, it was the knowing, the unsettling certainty that something was wrong, that he was being drawn into something he couldn't escape. Finally, Jack gave in. He stood up one last time, his face pale and drawn, and walked to the door. It was there again, standing in its usual corner. He took a deep breath and opened it once more. This time, there was no wall. On the other side, there was only darkness. Deep, impenetrable darkness. It stretched out beyond the edge of the doorframe, blacker than pitch. Jack could feel it, pressing against him, tugging at him like something alive. The room behind him felt cold, distant, as if it were a place he could no longer return to. His breath caught in his throat as a low, hollow sound echoed from the blackness beyond the door. It was a voice, barely a whisper, but it carried with it a weight, a presence. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice murmured, soft and haunting. "Now, you belong to it." Before Jack could react, the door slammed shut on its own, and the darkness swallowed everything. Jack was awake, or at least he thought he was. The hotel room felt different when he woke up, too quiet, too still. His eyes flicked open to a room bathed in the same dim light of the early morning. The walls, the furniture, the television, all the familiar trappings of his temporary space seemed unchanged, except for the nagging sensation in the pit of his stomach that something had shifted. Something had changed. The door. He glanced over at the corner where it should have been, the door that had haunted him for the past 2 nights. But to his relief, it was gone. The wall was empty, the space perfectly normal. The door that had appeared out of nowhere had vanished again. For a moment, Jack felt a rush of relief. Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe he had imagined it all. But then, his thoughts were interrupted by the feeling of eyes on him. The air in the room grew heavier, and Jack could feel it pressing against him, suffocating him. His heart began to race as his mind replayed everything, the darkness beyond the door, the voice, the unshakable presence that had surrounded him. He hadn't imagined it. He wasn't sure if it was real or not, but he hadn't imagined it. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked toward the corner where the door had been. The silence in the room was deafening. He placed his hand on the wall, half expecting it to feel cold, to feel something, anything, that would explain what had been happening. But it was just a wall. Solid, ordinary, and unremarkable. His pulse started to slow, and he let out a shaky breath. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe he was just tired. The strange sensation, the door, maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But even as he thought it, he knew he was lying to himself. Jack decided to get out of the room, to leave the hotel for a while and clear his head. He threw on a jacket, grabbed his wallet, and walked out of the room, making sure to lock the door behind him. As he made his way down the narrow hallway toward the elevator, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hotel, once dull and ordinary, now felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were watching him. His steps echoed in the hallway, louder than usual, like the floorboards were creaking with every movement. When he reached the elevator, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the far end of the hall, just past the turn toward the stairs, stood a figure. It was dark, but Jack could make out the vague outline of a person standing completely still, facing the wall. It was odd. Whoever it was, they hadn't moved for what seemed like ages. And yet, something about the figure seemed wrong. It was like they were waiting for something. Waiting for him. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he took an involuntary step back. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. It was as though it had been frozen in time. It was only when he turned his gaze away that he saw the door at the end of the hallway, just beyond the figure. The door was there again. It stood, silent and ominous, at the far end of the hallway, just as it had been in his room. The figure didn't move. Jack's eyes flicked between the figure and the door, and something deep inside him whispered that this was the same door, the door that shouldn't exist. The elevator bell rang, snapping him out of his trance. His hand trembled as he pressed the button, and the door slid open with a soft sound. He stepped inside and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But when the doors closed, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty. There was no door. It was as if it had never been there at all. Jack tried to shake off the unease that clung to him as he spent the day wandering around the city. He needed to distance himself from the hotel, from the creeping dread that had taken root in his mind. The day was a blur of streets and coffee shops, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that kept tugging at him. He kept telling himself it was just stress, that the door and the figure were mere figments of his imagination, manifestations of his exhaustion. But by nightfall, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was calling him back to the hotel. He couldn't push it out of his mind, no matter how hard he tried. When he returned to his room, the door was waiting again. It stood silently in the corner, exactly where it had been the first time. The walls felt colder, the air thicker. The door was there, and it wasn't. Jack knew that he had to face it, confront it. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending that it didn't exist. With a shaky breath, he walked toward it, his hand brushing against the wood. The handle was cool to the touch, and he hesitated, his mind screaming for him to stop. But the curiosity, the compulsion to know what lay beyond it, was too strong. Jack turned the knob. This time, the door didn't open to a blank wall. Instead, there was a room behind it. The air smelled stale, old, like something forgotten. The walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty objects. Old furniture, faded and cracked, sat in corners. The room was small, cramped, but familiar in a way Jack couldn't place. His heart raced as he stepped inside, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. It felt like he had stepped into someone else's memory, a room that wasn't supposed to be here, but that he somehow recognized. And then, the door behind him slammed shut. Jack spun around, panic surging through him. The room was now completely sealed. There was no way out. The walls seemed to close in, and the temperature dropped. He could hear faint whispers coming from the shadows, voices too low to understand, but their meaning was clear. Jack's chest tightened as he realized he was not alone in this room. His heart pounded in his ears as his gaze fell on something on the far wall, a mirror. He had been in this room before. He knew this room. He was the one who had put it there. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the truth came crashing down on him. The room was his. It was part of his past, his memories. The faces staring back at him from the mirror weren't strangers, they were him. He wasn't just a visitor in this place. He was trapped in it. This wasn't just the room behind the door, it was the life he had left behind. The voices grew louder, swirling around him, pressing against his mind, suffocating him. "You opened the door," they whispered. "Now you can never leave." The mirror before him shifted, the reflection warping as the people in it began to smile. The door was no longer there. It had vanished. The room had no exit. And Jack, standing in front of the mirror, understood. He had walked into a trap. The door wasn't just a door. It was a point of no return. And now, Jack was part of the story, just another echo in a place that had no end. As he reached out for the mirror, it cracked, shattering into thousands of pieces, each shard reflecting a part of him, a part of the life he had forgotten, a part of the life he would never escape. Jack sat in the center of the dark room, his hands trembling as he stared at the broken pieces of the mirror scattered around him. The shards reflected fragments of his face, distorted, splintered reflections that seemed to mock him. He tried to steady his breath, his mind swirling in chaos. What had he done? What had he opened? The room felt smaller now, like it was collapsing in on itself. The air was heavy with a presence, an invisible force that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. The whispers that had been so faint before now filled his ears, like 1,000 voices pressing into his skull. They were unintelligible, overlapping, but they all seemed to be saying the same thing. "You can't leave." Jack's pulse raced. His mind screamed for an escape, but his door, had vanished. There was no exit. No way out. Just the mirror shards and the suffocating silence. He stood up shakily, his heart pounding against his ribs as he frantically searched the room for any sign of escape. But the walls were closing in. Jack collapsed to the floor, his hands grasping at his hair. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the madness swirling around him. He had to focus. He had to think clearly. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. But deep down, a part of him knew that it was. He had unlocked something far darker than he could ever understand. The room began to change. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of his vision. The walls seemed to stretch, then shrink, then stretch again. The once static shadows shifted, growing longer, darker, as if something was moving inside them. The furniture, too, began to change. The small chair in the corner, which had previously been old but ordinary, now looked worn, distressed beyond reason, as if it had been sitting in this room for decades. Jack stood up again, the overwhelming sense of dread clawing at him. He had to find a way out. He had to find the door. But as he moved across the room, his eyes landed on the small bookshelf against the far wall. There was something about it, something that drew him in. He crossed the room, his footsteps unsteady on the creaking floor. The bookshelf was laden with old books, their pages yellowed with age. He ran his fingers along the spines, the dust coating his skin as he pulled a book free. It was an old, leather-bound tome with no title. No author. Just the faint smell of mildew and something else, a scent Jack couldn't place, but it felt familiar, like the room itself. The book felt unnaturally heavy in his hands, like it contained a weight far beyond its physical mass. He opened it to the first page and read the words scrawled inside. To understand what you've unlocked, you must remember the truth. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know why, but the words seemed to strike a chord deep within him, as if they had been waiting for him to read them. He turned the pages quickly, skimming the yellowed, brittle sheets. The writing became more erratic as he read on, phrases that felt like they were written for someone else, someone who had been here before. The pages bled into each other, blurred by time and faded ink. And then, on the last page, there was a drawing. A simple image of a door, dark and imposing, with the same faint blue color that Jack had seen in his memory. But the door was framed by shadows, surrounded by shapes that seemed to move, swirling like smoke. Jack turned the page over to find the words. Once you open it, you will not leave. You will become part of the door. The room felt like it was spinning now, and Jack stumbled back, the book slipping from his hands and falling to the floor with a hollow thud. He wanted to scream, to deny what he was seeing, but his voice failed him. His mind was unraveling, the lines between reality and nightmare becoming thinner by the second. He had to get out. He had to escape whatever was happening before it consumed him completely. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. It felt like something had entered, a presence, a force beyond understanding. The temperature dropped sharply, and Jack could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch even further, and in the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure, standing motionless, just beyond the edge of his vision. He whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Yet the figure remained, just outside of his direct sight. Jack's mind screamed in protest, and he backed away, the floorboards creaking under his feet as he moved. His hands gripped the edges of the desk, his breath coming in short gasps. Then, the whispers stopped. The room was silent now, except for the soft sound of his breathing. But in that silence, something else spoke. A voice, cold and deep, as if it came from the very walls. You shouldn't have opened it. Jack froze. The voice felt like it was coming from everywhere, surrounding him, drowning out his thoughts. It was as though the room itself had become alive, and it was speaking to him, warning him. You've unlocked what you don't understand, the voice continued. And now, you belong to the door. Jack turned to face the source of the voice, but there was no one. The room was empty, the shadows cast long and still, but the feeling of presence, of being watched, had never been more intense. And then he saw it. The figure was standing at the door. The same door that had vanished when he first entered. It stood there, solid and real, casting a long shadow across the room. The figure, a tall and indistinct silhouette, stood motionless before it, waiting. Jack's heart slammed against his ribcage as the figure slowly moved toward him. The door behind it creaked open, its hinges protesting as the dark void beyond beckoned. Jack's feet were rooted to the floor, his body unwilling to obey. The figure's movement was deliberate, slow, like a predator stalking its prey. It reached out, and for the first time, Jack saw its face, pale, empty, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his very soul. You've opened it, the figure said, its voice impossibly deep, reverberating through the air. And now, you will walk through. The figure reached out a hand, and Jack could feel an icy cold radiating from it. He wanted to run, to scream, to fight back, but his legs refused to move. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching toward him like hungry fingers. The door was open now, and beyond it was nothing but darkness. There was no choice left. The whispers were back, louder now, filling his mind with chaos, with certainty. The door was the only way out. But as he took one step forward, something deep within him, a forgotten memory, a voice from the past, whispered a warning. Don't go through. But it was too late. The darkness swallowed him whole. Jack's foot crossed the threshold, and the world went black. It wasn't a sudden shift. It was a gradual thing, like the slow sinking of a boat into an abyss, the waters taking their time to swallow him whole. He felt weightless, as if gravity no longer applied to him. The familiar world he had known, the hotel room, the eerie door, the figure standing in the shadows, vanished, leaving nothing but emptiness. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a tangible presence, a thing that pressed down on him, suffocating him from every angle. His breath came in short gasps as he struggled to move, but it was like wading through molasses. His limbs felt numb, like they were no longer part of his body. Every step forward, if it could even be called a step, felt like an eternity, stretching out in slow motion. The whispers returned. They were louder now, not just voices, but full sentences, chaotic and incomprehensible. They filled his head, each word an echo of something else. They scraped against his mind like nails on a chalkboard, growing more insistent with each passing second. You've opened the door. Now you belong to it. Jack tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He felt the overwhelming pull of the darkness, dragging him deeper. The air, if it could even be called air, felt thick, suffocating, as if he was breathing in the very essence of despair. There is no going back. In the pitch-black space, he thought he saw a faint light in the distance, a sliver, a glow that flickered like a dying ember. It called to him, beckoning him forward with a promise of salvation, of answers. Without thinking, Jack moved toward it, his body no longer his own. He couldn't remember if he was walking or falling. The light grew brighter, and with it, a shape began to emerge from the shadows, a figure, just like the one he had seen before, standing before the door. The same tall silhouette, now more distinct in the light, its features clear but distorted. It was the same figure that had greeted him in the hotel room, that had led him here. "You've crossed the line, Jack," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant, as if it came from every corner of the room. "Now, you're mine." The figure's face was pallid, its eyes black pits that seemed to swirl with an unfathomable void. Its lips parted in a smile, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a cruel, hollow thing, like something that had once been human but had long since shed all trace of warmth. Jack stopped. Something in him, the last flicker of sanity, perhaps, told him to turn back, to run, to escape. But he couldn't. The darkness had taken hold of him, pulling him into its grasp. The door he had opened wasn't just a physical entryway, it was a passage to something far worse, something ancient, something that had always been waiting. "You've always belonged to the door, Jack," the figure continued, its voice twisting in his ears. "Everything you've done, every step you've taken, has led you to this point. The door isn't just a thing. It's a part of you. It's the part of you that you've been running from." Jack's mind raced. What was it saying? What did it mean? He had tried to outrun his past, to escape the weight of his mistakes, his regrets. But now, he realized, it wasn't his past that had been chasing him. It was the door. The door had always been there, waiting for him to open it. "No," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse. "I don't. I didn't know." The figure stepped closer, its form becoming more defined, more real. Jack could see the twisted details now, the sickly gray skin, the sharp, elongated fingers that reached out toward him. "You never knew because you never remembered," the figure said, its smile widening. "But now you do. Now you understand." 4.2 The truth revealed. In the darkness, the figure's words echoed in Jack's mind like a ringing bell. Now you understand. But what did he understand? What had he opened? The figure seemed to draw closer, and Jack instinctively took a step back. But no matter how far he moved, it was always within reach, its gaze unblinking, its presence suffocating. "You opened the door," it repeated, its voice growing colder, sharper. "And you know what that means. It means you can never leave. You never will." Jack's chest tightened. The truth hit him like a freight train. He wasn't just trapped in this room, this place. He was trapped in a cycle that had started long before he had ever opened the door. His entire life had been a series of choices, each one leading him closer to this moment. The door wasn't a physical thing. It was a manifestation of his deepest fears, his regrets, his unacknowledged past. The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated through the emptiness. "You can't escape yourself, Jack. Not now. Not ever." The last of Jack's sanity began to slip away, his mind breaking under the weight of the realization. He had been running all his life, from something he couldn't understand, from something that had always been a part of him. And now, there was no escape. "No!" Jack screamed, his voice finally breaking free. He turned to run, to escape the figure, but as he turned around, the darkness swallowed him whole. The last thing he saw was the door, now standing before him, solid and real, its edges gleaming in the dim light. He was back at the beginning. 4.3 The Endless Cycle. Jack's footsteps echoed as he walked toward the door, just as he had done before. He reached out for the handle, but before his hand could touch it, a sudden clarity hit him. This was it. This was the moment where it all started, where it had always started. The door wasn't a doorway to something else. It was a doorway to himself. The door was a mirror, reflecting everything he had tried to bury, the choices, the guilt, the regrets. There was no escape, because the door was not just a thing. It was a part of him. Jack's fingers grazed the handle, and in that instant, everything clicked. The truth was clear. There was no escape. He had been through this before, again and again. The door had opened countless times, but he had never truly crossed it. He had always been standing on the other side, waiting for something to change, but it never did. The figure's laughter echoed in his mind. "You opened the door, Jack. And now you'll never leave." The door swung open. Story 6. The phone rang just past midnight. Dr. Lauren Evans, a therapist with over 15 years of practice, hadn't been expecting any calls at this hour. She had just wrapped up her evening routine, made a cup of tea, turned on her favorite classical playlist to wind down, and sprawled on her couch with a good book. But the phone, ringing insistently in the quiet of her living room, had shattered the calm. It wasn't unusual for her to get late-night calls from anxious clients, but this one was different. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and there was a lingering feeling in the pit of her stomach. A sense of dread crept in as she reached for the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice was steady, but her pulse quickened. At first, there was nothing but static on the other end. Then, a voice broke through, soft, almost too soft, but unmistakable. "Dr. Evans? It's me. Rachel. Rachel Rydell." Lauren's heart stopped for a brief moment. She blinked, her mind racing. Rachel Rydell. Her mind flashed back to the young woman who had once been a patient of hers, a troubled soul, struggling with deep-seated depression and anxiety. Rachel had been in her mid-20s, shy and withdrawn, with a history of trauma that made her an especially challenging case. They worked together for months until one fateful day Rachel had just vanished. She had stopped showing up for sessions. The phone calls stopped, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. Lauren had never gotten closure. She hadn't even realized Rachel had passed away in a tragic car accident nearly a year ago until the hospital had called to inform her of the details. There had been no final goodbye. No last words. Rachel had simply disappeared from her life. Now, her voice was back, crackling through the phone, soft but pleading. I need to talk. I never got the chance to finish what we started. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be Rachel. She had been gone for so long. Rachel? Lauren's voice was shaky now. This isn't possible. You're dead. The line went dead. Silence. Lauren stared at the phone, her heart hammering in her chest. The cold air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the quiet more oppressive. She sat frozen, not sure whether to laugh at herself or scream. Maybe it was a prank, a sick joke, but she had no idea who would have done something like that. The voice on the other end had been unmistakable. Before she could gather her thoughts, the phone rang again. With trembling hands, Lauren picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was now distorted, as if fighting through static, but it was Rachel again, unmistakably. I'm sorry, Dr. Evans. Please, you have to help me finish this. Lauren's skin prickled. She tried to focus, to clear the fog of disbelief from her mind. The last session she had with Rachel was vivid in her memory, a young woman on the edge, expressing her fear of abandonment, her suffocating anxiety. But she had never imagined Rachel's words would be her last. Rachel, why are you calling me? How are you even? Lauren's voice cracked, and she swallowed hard. The voice came through again, faint but clear. I never got the chance to finish. The things I said, they weren't everything. Lauren's stomach churned. She had heard that voice so many times in therapy, had spent hours sitting across from Rachel, listening to her talk about her fears, her memories, her broken family. She could feel the weight of those unspoken words between them. But how could Rachel be calling her now? She was supposed to be gone. There was no way this was real. Where are you? Lauren asked, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. Please, just tell me where you are. The line went quiet for a moment, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was low, almost breathless. Room 407. The words hit Lauren like a punch in the gut. Room 407. The very room that had become infamous in her mind, the room where Rachel had spent her final days in the hospital. It had been a long stretch of dark days, filled with medication adjustments and forced therapy, but nothing had worked. Rachel had grown more distant, more withdrawn. Eventually, Lauren had lost touch. The last thing she remembered was Rachel's haunting words during their final session, I don't think I can come back from this. But now, room 407. The thought made Lauren's skin crawl. She had never visited the hospital room in person, not after Rachel's death. She had seen her name in the obituary, heard the whispers from colleagues who had worked with her, but she had never been able to visit the place where Rachel had ended her life. There had been no closure, just the lingering questions and guilt. Rachel, where are you? What do you mean? Lauren asked, her voice pleading. You're dead. You. But before she could finish her sentence, the line went silent again. The next morning, Lauren couldn't shake the conversation. The voice. The plea for help. Room 407. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Rachel's face, the young woman full of potential, suddenly torn away by the darkness that had consumed her. Lauren had always wondered what more she could have done. What more could anyone have done? She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, the weight of exhaustion pressing against her eyes. She hadn't slept all night, not since the call. It was just too much, too unreal. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened. Rachel had said room 407, but was it just a trick of the mind? A lingering echo from her past? Lauren couldn't tell. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't ignore it. Something had been left undone, and Rachel's words kept haunting her. With a steady breath, Lauren grabbed her keys, her purse, and her coat. She knew where she had to go. The hospital. The one place she never wanted to return. The place where Rachel's ghost still lingered. Lauren drove to the hospital in a daze. The familiar route felt like a distant memory, the streets empty and quiet under the low-hanging fog. She hadn't been to this part of town in over a year, not since Rachel's death. The hospital, once a place of routine, now felt like a foreign, oppressive place. It loomed before her as she pulled into the parking lot, its sterile, white walls towering like an unfinished monument. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air. She parked and sat there for a few moments, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The thoughts running through her head were chaotic. Rachel's voice, pleading with her to come to room 407, the feeling of guilt that had never left her since their last session. How could she have missed it? How could she not have seen the signs? She had been Rachel's therapist for months, and yet she couldn't save her. She couldn't bring her back. The conversation the night before played over and over in her mind. Room 407. Rachel had said it like it meant something. Like it was important. But why? What was she trying to tell Lauren from beyond the grave? With a deep breath, Lauren pushed open the car door and stepped out, the cold air biting at her skin. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and made her way to the hospital's entrance, each step heavier than the last. As she walked through the automatic doors, the sterile scent of antiseptic hit her. The hospital was quieter than usual, the hallways devoid of people. It felt like time had stopped here, like the place itself had become a mausoleum for the dead. Her footsteps echoed as she moved down the hallway, past the flickering fluorescent lights and the closed doors that seemed to watch her. She reached the elevator and pressed the button to the 4th floor, her heart racing as the doors slid open. The quiet hum of the elevator was the only sound, and Lauren tried to steady her breath. She had been here so many times before, but it felt different now. She wasn't just a therapist anymore. She was a woman searching for answers, for closure, for the truth. The elevator dinged as it reached the 4th floor, and the doors opened. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit and eerily silent. She could almost hear the ghosts of the past whispering along the walls, the memories of the patients who had been here before. At the far end of the hall, she saw the sign that read room 407. Lauren's stomach twisted, and she felt her pulse quicken. She knew she had to go. She had to see what was behind that door. But with every step, the dread deepened. It wasn't just Rachel's voice that haunted her, it was the weight of everything she had left behind. The unspoken words, the untold stories. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to leave this place, but she couldn't. She couldn't walk away from this any longer. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door. Room 407 was exactly as she remembered. It was small, unremarkable, Just another hospital room with sterile white walls, a bed in the center, and a small chair by the window. The blinds were drawn, blocking out the light. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and loneliness. The air felt thick with something that couldn't be named. Lauren stepped inside, her footsteps silent on the linoleum floor. She glanced around, half expecting to see Rachel sitting in the chair by the window, looking at her with that familiar, pained expression. But there was no one. The bed was empty. There were no belongings, no personal items, just the cold, impersonal furnishings of a hospital room. She walked over to the bed, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the white sheets. Her mind raced. This doesn't make sense, she thought. This room is supposed to be empty. Rachel's gone. She's gone. Yet, something about the room felt alive. It wasn't just the memories, it was something more. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. A presence lingered in the corners, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. "Rachel?" Lauren whispered, her voice shaky, her words barely escaping her lips. No response. She turned toward the small desk by the wall, where a few papers had been left behind. The familiar scent of old ink and paper filled the air as she scanned the items, a medical chart, some forms, and a notebook. Lauren's hand froze on the notebook as she noticed something written on the first page, a scrawled note in Rachel's handwriting. "I can't tell her. I don't think I can do this. I'm scared. Please don't let her think I'm crazy." The words sent a chill through Lauren's body. This wasn't just a note. This was a cry for help. It was the kind of thing Rachel would have written in private, in the safety of her own thoughts, afraid to share the truth with anyone. Lauren's breath quickened as she flipped through the pages, reading Rachel's words. They were a jumbled mess of fears, of fragmented thoughts, of an unraveling mind. The last entry, written just days before Rachel had died, stood out. "The door. I saw it. The door is real. And it's waiting for me." Lauren closed the notebook with a sudden, sharp motion, her heart pounding. She could feel the room close in around her, the air thick with the echoes of Rachel's final days. Rachel had known something, had seen something that Lauren had never understood. And now, she was left with nothing but the haunting words and the lingering presence of a patient who had never truly left. The sudden ring of Lauren's phone startled her, breaking her from her thoughts. She jumped, her heart skipping a beat. She fumbled for her phone, her hand shaking as she answered. "Hello," she said, her voice unsteady. There was no answer at first, only static and the faint sound of breathing. "Rachel?" Lauren whispered, almost afraid to say the name. The voice that came through was distorted, low, but unmistakable. "Dr. Evans." "It's me," the voice said, sending a chill down her spine. "I need your help." Lauren's stomach turned, and her breath caught in her throat. The voice was coming from the phone, but it felt like it was coming from all around her, as though Rachel were standing right there in the room with her. "I can't escape it," Rachel's voice continued, trembling. "The door, it's calling me. I can't get out of it." Lauren's grip on the phone tightened. The door. The same door Rachel had mentioned before, the one that had haunted her final thoughts. The one that now seemed to call out from beyond the grave. "What do you mean?" Lauren asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What door?" "The one in the room," Rachel said. "The one in room 407. It's not just a door, Dr. Evans. It's a way out. A way to escape." But it's too late for me. You need to stop it. The line went dead. Lauren's breath was ragged as she stared at the phone in her hand. Her mind reeled, the words echoing in her head. You need to stop it. But stop what? What was happening in room 407? What had Rachel seen that Lauren hadn't? She looked back at the empty bed, at the silent walls, at the notebook with Rachel's final words. And for the first time, Lauren felt a deep, bone-chilling certainty Rachel's death hadn't been the end. Something had followed her. And now, it was waiting for Lauren to understand. Lauren stepped back toward the door, her mind racing. She had to leave. She had to escape this place before it consumed her, too. But as she reached for the door handle, something stopped her. The door didn't feel right. She turned, her heart pounding, and saw something that made her freeze. In the reflection of the glass on the door, Rachel's face appeared. Her eyes wide, pleading. Don't open it. You're next. The door slammed shut in front of her, and the room grew colder. Lauren stumbled back from the door, her pulse thudding in her ears. The reflection, Rachel's face, had been so clear, so real. Her eyes had looked right at Lauren, pleading, desperate, as if trying to warn her. The door that had slammed shut before her was now the only thing in the room that seemed to have any substance. It stood there, silently, waiting, mocking her fear. She gasped for air, her thoughts spiraling out of control. She could feel the cold creeping into her bones, the chill from the hospital room seeping into her skin. What was happening? What did Rachel mean by "you're next"? Lauren's hand hovered over the door handle, her fingertips trembling. It was as if the door was calling her, beckoning her to open it. But the part of her that was rational, the part that had been trained to handle crises, screamed at her to run, get out, get back to safety. She had spent years in therapy rooms with people who experienced deep trauma, but nothing had ever felt like this. This wasn't a case of mind over matter. This was something beyond reason, something that couldn't be explained away by stress or anxiety. Her breath became shallow as she stepped back, her mind clouded by dread. The hospital was silent around her, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound in the otherwise still room. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Rachel standing behind her, but there was nothing. Just the room. Just the door. But as she took another step back, something else caught her eye. The bed. It was no longer empty. The figure in the bed was not Rachel, at least, not exactly. It was a silhouette, shrouded in the shadows, its form twisted in an unnatural way. A gaunt figure, its features barely distinguishable in the dim light, but the shape was unmistakable. Lauren's heart pounded as she took a step closer, instinctively moving toward the bed. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body betrayed her. There was something about this room, something pulling her toward it, toward the bed. The figure on the bed slowly shifted, and for a moment, Lauren thought it was Rachel, but it wasn't. It was something else. Something worse. The figure's face slowly began to emerge from the shadows, and Lauren's breath hitched. The face wasn't Rachel's, but it was familiar. It was her own. The skin was pale, drained of color, stretched tightly across the skull, with hollow eyes staring directly at Lauren. It wasn't just a reflection of herself, it was a version of herself that she had never seen, twisted and gaunt, a distortion of her own humanity. The thing in the bed, smiled at her, but the smile was wrong. It was empty. Hollow. And then, in the silence, it spoke. "You've come to join me," the figure whispered in a voice that was a sickening echo of Lauren's own. Lauren's knees buckled, her hands gripping the edge of the bed to steady herself. The voice was hers, but it was darker, colder, like it was coming from deep within the bowels of the earth. "What do you want from me?" Lauren's voice was barely a whisper, the words scraping from her throat. The figure on the bed seemed to grin wider, its mouth stretching impossibly, the skin of its face distorting as if it were alive in a way that defied nature. "It's not about what I want, Lauren. It's about what you've already given." The room grew colder still. Lauren could feel her teeth starting to chatter, her body trembling uncontrollably as the figure in the bed continued to speak, its voice dripping with venom. "You think you've escaped the past," it said. "You think you can hide behind your career, your professionalism, your distance from the truth. But it's all caught up to you now. Rachel isn't gone. Neither are you." The words clawed at her mind, digging deeper into her thoughts, dredging up the buried guilt and the things she had long since buried. The truth she had avoided for years, the truth about Rachel, about the mistakes she had made, the lines she had crossed in the name of therapy. The boundary between patient and therapist had never been so clear in her mind until now, but the more the figure spoke, the more the lines blurred. The figure tilted its head, its eyes glinting darkly. "Rachel isn't the only one who couldn't escape." Lauren staggered back from the bed, her breath shallow, the walls closing in around her. She could feel the air thinning, the room pressing in on her. What was this? What was happening to her? In a desperate attempt to break free from the madness consuming her, Lauren turned and bolted for the door. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this room before it swallowed her whole. But when she reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. The door wouldn't open. The room began to distort again, the edges of her vision darkening. It felt like she was standing in a space that didn't exist, a place that was nothing but a twisted reflection of her own mind. The walls shifted, and the once familiar hospital room was now a distorted, alien version of itself. The shadows stretched long and menacing, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. She turned back toward the bed, but the figure was gone. The room was empty again. The bed was empty. It was as though Rachel, herself, had never been there. But then, the door appeared again, but it wasn't like before. It was no longer just a simple door. It was dark, jagged, like it had been torn from reality itself. The door frame was cracked, as though it had been there for ages, waiting for something to open it. Lauren stepped toward it, her heart hammering in her chest. Her instincts told her to run, to flee from this madness, but the door, it was calling her. And she couldn't stop herself from reaching for the handle. Her fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment, nothing happened. The world around her held its breath, waiting for something to change. Then, the door creaked open. The light from the other side was not warm. It was harsh, white, and blinding. As the door opened wider, Lauren stepped through, her eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden brightness. She found herself in a room that felt even more distorted, more unreal than the last. The air was thick with dust, the walls cracked and peeling, as though time had left this place behind long ago. And standing in the center of the room was Rachel. But this was not the Rachel Lauren had known. This Rachel was different, darker, colder, with hollow eyes and a face twisted with grief. She didn't smile this time. She just stood there, staring at Lauren with that same unblinking gaze. "You were never meant to save me," Rachel said, her voice hollow and final. Lauren's heart skipped a beat. I tried," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I tried to help you, Rachel. I couldn't save you, but You didn't fail me, Lauren," Rachel interrupted, her voice hardening. You failed yourself. Lauren's vision blurred. The weight of those words, those accusations, crushed her. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. Everything she had thought she knew about herself, about her work, about her responsibility, everything was crumbling. Rachel took a step toward her, and Lauren instinctively took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind her. The room was sealed now. Welcome to room 407, Rachel said, her voice colder than ever. And then, the world went dark. Lauren's breath came in sharp gasps, her chest tightening as the darkness engulfed her. The room was pitch black, the oppressive silence pressing down on her like a weight. She could no longer feel the floor beneath her feet, and she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or shut. The cold air clung to her skin like a second layer of frost, as though she had been standing outside for hours in a snowstorm. Her thoughts swirled in a frenzy. What was happening? She couldn't even tell if she was still in the hospital or somewhere else entirely. All she knew was that Rachel's voice was still with her, echoing in her mind, pulling her deeper into the abyss. You never understood, Rachel's voice whispered in the darkness. Not really. The words were like a whisper against her ear, like a soft caress that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Lauren tried to move, to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't seem to find the strength to stand, to escape this oppressive void that had swallowed her whole. Where am I? The thought echoed in her mind, desperate, but there was no answer. Only the silence, and then light. A faint flicker, a weak glow from far above her. Slowly, like the dawning of an unwanted reality, the room began to take shape. The darkness receded, revealing an old, cracked floor beneath her. The familiar sterile white walls of the hospital were now decaying, peeling like the skin of an old corpse. And in the center of it all, standing like a statue in the middle of a forgotten room, was Rachel. Rachel was still there. But she was different. The twisted, olive face she had shown Lauren before had softened, the grief and pain replaced by something else, something darker. The shadows around her seemed to cling to her, like they were part of her. Rachel's eyes were no longer pleading. They were knowing. Cold. You didn't listen to me, Rachel's voice rang out in the stillness, a final, mournful tone that echoed through the room. Lauren's heart pounded as she took a step forward, but the ground felt uneven under her feet. Every movement seemed to pull her deeper into the room, into Rachel's world, where the lines between what was real and what was not had long since blurred. I tried, Lauren said, her voice trembling. I tried to help you, Rachel. I didn't know. I couldn't. Rachel raised a hand, cutting her off. No. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't understand what I was really asking for. Lauren stood frozen, the weight of those words pressing down on her chest. She didn't know how to respond. She had never truly understood Rachel's pain. Her inability to save her had always gnawed at Lauren's conscience, but she never imagined it would come to this, a haunting, a chase into the very core of Rachel's torment. You weren't just my therapist, Lauren, Rachel continued, her voice now chillingly calm. You were supposed to save me. But instead, you trapped me here. You left me to rot in my own head. Lauren's stomach churned. Trapped? Was this really Rachel speaking to her? Or was it some twisted version of Rachel, the part of herself that had been buried, forgotten, left to die in that room? You think you're here to help me, but you're just as lost as I was. Rachel's voice grew colder, more distant. You don't understand. This is where it all ends. Lauren stepped back, her heart racing. "What are you saying?" Rachel tilted her head, her eyes now sharp, unblinking. "You opened the door, Lauren. You opened it, and now you're stuck here with me. There's no going back. No escape from what you've done." The last words of Rachel echoed in Lauren's mind as she tried to run, but her legs were frozen. She could no longer move, could no longer turn away. The walls of the room began to close in, the air thickening, pressing down on her chest like a vice. "You're part of this now," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the suffocating darkness. "Just like I was." Lauren's thoughts were racing as she struggled to understand what Rachel was telling her. She had opened the door. She had come to help, to find the truth, but now it was clear she was a part of it. She was just as trapped as Rachel had been. Trapped in the same dark, endless cycle of guilt and despair. She had never been able to save Rachel, but now, it seemed, she was doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. She looked around the room, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The door, the one that had appeared when Rachel's voice first called her, was now closed. Locked. There was no way out. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her, tightening their grip like a noose. The reflection of Rachel was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. But Lauren knew the truth now. The door had never been just a door. It was a prison. And the only way out was to face what she had done. To confront the truth she had never been willing to see. And just like that, the door opened. But this time, Lauren didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. She walked through the door, not knowing what waited her on the other side, but knowing that she had no choice but to face it. As she stepped through the doorway, Lauren was struck by the silence. It was an overwhelming silence, the kind that deafens you. The air felt heavier here, thicker and colder than before. She felt like she was in a dream, a nightmare, but it was real. It had to be real. She turned, and the door behind her slammed shut. "Rachel," she whispered, her voice shaking, but the room was empty. There were no shadows, no whispers, no figures lurking in the corners. It was just her. Alone. In a space that no longer had any definition. It was as though she had stepped outside of time into a place where the rules no longer applied. And then she heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first. The ringing of a phone. She turned toward the sound, the echo of it almost familiar. The phone, her phone, sat on a table in the corner of the room. Hesitantly, she approached, reaching for it with a shaking hand. The screen flickered to life, the caller ID flashing. Rachel Rydell. Lauren's heart stopped. But there was no time to answer. The door behind her creaked open once more.